The morning fog rolled off Moonrise Harbor like a sleeping giant's breath, revealing the Oregon coast one weathered plank at a time. Jake Brennan stood at the edge of his pier, steam rising from his coffee mug as he watched the daily resurrection of his world. The routine never changed. 15 sharp, he'd unlock the garage doors, flip the ancient marine radio to the weather report, and survey the boats that waited like loyal dogs for his attention. The harbor held 38 vessels on any given day, from salmon trawlers scarred by decades of Pacific storms to pleasure craft owned by Portland weekenders who treated the ocean like their personal playground. Jake knew every engine's particular wheeze, every hull's unique complaint against the salt. His garage, inherited from his father and grandfather before him, squatted at the water's edge like a barnacle that had learned to love its rock. Behind him, the floorboards of the small house creaked with familiar footsteps. Avery appeared in the doorway, 17 years old and carrying herself like someone who'd learned early that the world demanded more than it gave. Her auburn hair, so much like her mother's, hung in careful waves that framed a face that grew more beautiful and stubborn each day. She clutched a digital recorder against her chest, its memory filled with interviews and research for the true crime podcast she'd been producing since junior year. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can look at her outboard today," she said, settling into the worn wooden chair beside him. "She says it's making that grinding noise again." Jake smiled. Mrs. Patterson's 15-year-old Evinrude made the same sound every spring, a grinding protest that meant nothing more than old parts settling into another season. But she worried about it like a mother hen, and he'd learned that sometimes peace of mind was worth more than the $20 service call. "Tell her I'll swing by after lunch. What have you got planned for today?" Avery held up the recorder, working on episode 12 of Harbor Mysteries. "I'm investigating that chemical spill from 3 years ago, the one the county said was just agricultural runoff." Her voice carried the skeptical tone of someone who'd grown up hearing adult explanations that didn't quite add up. Since her mother's death 4 years ago, Avery had retreated into investigation the way others might retreat into sports or social media. Her podcast had started as a school project, but had evolved into something more serious, tackling local mysteries with the dogged persistence of a seasoned journalist. She'd inherited her mother's intuition and Jake's mechanical mind, creating a combination that made adults uncomfortable when she started asking the right questions. "Be careful with that one," Jake said, though he was proud of her initiative. "Sometimes people don't like having old wounds reopen." "Sometimes old wounds need reopening," she replied, echoing something she'd probably heard on one of the professional true crime shows she studied religiously. The truth doesn't stop being true just because it's inconvenient. Jake watched her head back into the house, noting the determined set of her shoulders that reminded him painfully of his brother Ryan. Like Ryan, Avery had developed an early awareness that the world contained more injustice than most people wanted to acknowledge. Unlike Ryan, she'd channeled that awareness into something constructive rather than confrontational. The harbor began to stir with the day's first activities. Captain Valdez fired up his salmon trawler, the diesel engine coughing to life with a sound like an old man clearing his throat. The Sarah's Dream, a charter boat that ferried tourists to the offshore fishing grounds, bobbed gently at her mooring, waiting for the day's clients to arrive from the bed and breakfast along Highway 101. Everything had its place, its purpose, its predictable rhythm. That's when he saw her. The sailboat appeared through the dissipating void like something from a different world, 42 feet of well-maintained fiberglass, with lines that spoke of serious ocean voyaging rather than weekend harbor hopping. She moved under sail alone, her engine silent, guided by a single figure at the helm. Jake had seen plenty of cruising boats in his years working the harbor, but this one was different. The hull showed the kind of wear that came from long passages, and the way she moved through the water suggested modifications that went beyond standard recreational equipment. The woman steering wore faded jeans and a navy fleece jacket, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even from a distance, Jake could see the focused intensity in her posture, the way she handled the sailboat with confidence that came from real knowledge rather than casual weekend sailing. She brought the boat alongside the guest pier with precision that spoke of countless hours at sea, reading wind and current like a familiar language. Jake finished his coffee and headed down to the pier. Harbor courtesy demanded that he at least offer assistance, though something about the whole scene made him cautious. Visiting sailors sometimes brought complications, complaints about noise, demands for services the harbor couldn't provide, assumptions about what small-town life owed them. "Morning," he called as the woman secured her lines. "Welcome to Moonrise Harbor." She looked up, and Jake felt a small jolt of recognition that made no sense. Her face was angular but tired, with the kind of weariness that came from more than just a long passage. Her eyes were dark green and carefully guarded, holding depths that suggested she'd seen more of the world than she'd wanted to. "Thank you. I'm Emma Parker," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of an accent that might have been educated East Coast, but had been softened by years of other places. "I understand you're the harbor's mechanic." She stepped onto the pier with the easy balance of someone who'd spent serious time on boats, but her hands were too clean for commercial fishing, too soft for daily maintenance work. This was someone who knew boats but didn't make her living with them. "Jake Brennan, what can I do for you?" "I'm having engine trouble. Nothing catastrophic, but I'd rather not push my luck. Would you have time to take a look?" Jake nodded, though something in her tone suggested this was more than routine maintenance. "Sure, let me grab my tools." As he walked back to the garage, he found himself wondering about Emma Parker. The sailboat flew Oregon registration, but the wear patterns on her deck suggested she'd been living aboard for months, maybe longer. Her clothes were practical but expensive, chosen for durability rather than fashion. And there was something in her eyes that reminded him of Avery, that careful distance that came from protecting secrets. He gathered his diagnostic equipment and headed back to the pier where Emma waited beside her sailboat. The morning sun had burned off the last of the fog, revealing the harbor in all its weathered glory. Salmon trollers headed out for their first runs of the day, their wakes spreading in neat V's across the calm water. The scene was so familiar, so comfortingly routine, that it took Jake a moment to register what was different. Emma Parker didn't belong here. Not in the way that marked her as obviously foreign, but in the way that suggested she came from a world where problems were solved with money and influence rather than patience and ingenuity. Yet here she was, asking for help with the kind of straightforward competence that spoke of genuine need. "She's a beautiful boat," Jake said, stepping aboard. "Custom design." Emma's answer came a beat too quick, a fraction too guarded. "The previous owner made some modifications. The engine compartment is this way." She led him below through a salon that managed to be both comfortable and utterly practical. The furnishings were expensive, but chosen for life at sea, everything secured, everything positioned for stability in rough weather. Charts covered the navigation table, marked with courses that suggested months of careful planning. But it was the electronics that caught Jake's attention. The communication array was far more sophisticated than most recreational sailors needed, and the computer systems looked like they belonged on a research vessel. The engine compartment was where things got interesting. Jake had worked on everything from ancient single-cylinder fishing boats to modern yachts bristling with computer-controlled systems. He'd seen experimental engines, hybrid systems, even a few boats powered by alternative fuels. But Emma's engine was something else entirely. The basic configuration was familiar marine diesel, water-cooled, designed for long-distance cruising. But the modifications were extraordinary. The injection system had been completely rebuilt, with components that looked like they belonged in a laboratory. The cooling system incorporated materials he didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that suggested heat recovery and efficiency far beyond normal marine applications. Most striking of all was the monitoring system. Instead of standard gauges and warning lights, Emma's engine was governed by a computer interface that tracked operating parameters in real time, displaying efficiency ratios and performance metrics with scientific precision. "This is remarkable work," Jake said, running his hands over the modified components. "Who did the conversion?" Emma hesitated just long enough for him to notice. "A specialty shop in Seattle. They do custom work for research vessels." It was a reasonable answer, but something in her tone suggested it wasn't the complete truth. Research vessels needed reliability and efficiency, but this engine was designed for something else. Stealth and independence, the ability to run long distances without leaving the normal signatures of passage. "What kind of trouble are you having?" "Intermittent power loss. It runs fine for hours, then suddenly drops to maybe 60% output. The computer shows all systems normal, but I can feel the difference." Jake nodded, connecting his diagnostic equipment to the engine's computer interface. The readouts confirmed what Emma had described, all systems operating within normal parameters, but with subtle variations that suggested an underlying problem. He'd seen similar issues before, usually caused by fuel contamination or sensor malfunction. But as he dug deeper into the diagnostic data, he found something that made him pause. The engine's performance history showed operational patterns unlike anything he'd seen in recreational boating. Long passages at constant speed, minimal time and harbor fuel consumption, optimized for maximum range rather than comfort or convenience. This wasn't a pleasure yacht being used for coastal cruising. It was a vessel designed for someone who needed to travel long distances without drawing attention, to operate independently for extended periods, to disappear into the vast anonymity of the ocean. "How long have you been aboard?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. "A few months. I'm taking some time to explore the coast." Another reasonable answer that felt incomplete. Jake had met plenty of people taking extended cruises, but they usually traveled with companions, made friends in every harbor, collected stories and experiences like souvenirs. Emma Parker traveled alone, spoke carefully, and kept her business to herself. "I think I found your problem," he said, pointing to a sensor reading on his diagnostic display. "One of your temperature sensors is giving intermittent readings. The computer thinks the engine is overheating and automatically reduces power. It's probably just a loose connection, but I'll need to trace the wiring to be sure." "How long will that take?" "A day, maybe two. I'll need to order a replacement sensor if the wiring checks out fine." He saw something flicker across her face, not impatience but concern. The kind of worry that came from needing to keep moving, from having reasons to avoid staying in one place too long. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No, of course not. I appreciate your help." But as they climbed back up to the deck, Jake found himself wondering what Emma was really running from and why her sailboat was equipped like a vessel designed to vanish without a trace. In his experience, people only invested in that kind of capability when they had serious reasons to disappear. The morning was fully established now, with the harbor busy with the day's activities. Emma stood at the rail watching the salmon trollers heading out to sea with an expression that mixed longing and caution. She looked like someone who understood the attraction of the horizon, but had learned to be careful about what might be following in her wake. "I'll get started on the diagnostics this afternoon," Jake said. "You're welcome to use the harbor facilities, shower, laundry, whatever you need." "Thank you. That's very kind." As he walked back toward his garage, Jake found himself thinking about the careful way Emma spoke, the practiced ease with which she deflected personal questions, the subtle modifications to her sailboat that suggested preparation for extended solo voyaging. In his experience, people only lived that way when they had compelling reasons to stay mobile and anonymous. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of Avery's voice as she emerged from the house to hang laundry on the line that stretched between two weathered posts. Emma turned at the sound, and Jake caught a glimpse of something unexpected in her expression, a kind of gentle attention that suggested she understood something about teenagers that most adults missed. The rest of the morning passed in familiar rhythms. Jake worked on Mrs. Patterson's outboard, which indeed needed nothing more than a carburetor, cleaning, and fresh spark plugs. He adjusted the prop shaft on Captain Valdez's salmon troller and diagnosed a cooling system problem on a weekend sailor's powerboat. Normal work, the kind of steady problem-solving that had sustained 3 generations of Brennans in Moonrise Harbor. But throughout the routine tasks, his mind kept returning to Emma Parker and her mysteriously modified sailboat. There was something about her that triggered every protective instinct he'd developed since losing his wife, something that suggested her arrival in Moonrise Harbor was going to change the careful equilibrium of his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. As the lunch hour approached, Jake found himself looking forward to the engine diagnostic work with more interest than a simple sensor problem usually warranted. Emma Parker might be running from something, but she'd also brought the first genuinely intriguing challenge he'd faced in months. And despite his better judgment, he was curious to learn more about the woman whose green eyes held secrets deeper than the Pacific itself. The harbor stretched ahead, full of familiar sights and sounds that had comforted him through 4 years of widowhood and the ongoing challenge of raising a daughter who was growing more independent each day. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jake felt the stirring of something he'd almost forgotten, the sense that his carefully ordered world might be about to become considerably more interesting. Whether that would prove to be a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. But as he watched Emma Parker move about her sailboat with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to solving problems alone, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their meeting was more than simple coincidence. Some arrivals, he learned, were destined to change everything. The afternoon brought a change in weather that matched Jake's shifting mood. Clouds gathered over the coastal mountains, promising the kind of spring rain that would drive most recreational boaters to cover but wouldn't bother the working boats heading out for the evening fishing. Jake had spent the lunch hour reviewing engine manuals, preparing for the diagnostic work on Emma's sailboat, but his concentration kept fragmenting. Something about Emma Parker nagged at him like a splinter he couldn't quite locate. It wasn't just her obvious evasiveness or the over-engineered modifications to her boat. It was something more fundamental, a quality in her watchfulness that reminded him uncomfortably of the months after Ryan's death, when he'd found himself studying every corporate press release and safety report, looking for patterns that might explain why his brother had died in what everyone insisted was a simple industrial accident. "Dad, you're brooding again." Avery's voice cut through his reverie as she appeared in the garage doorway, digital recorder in hand, and that particular expression that meant she'd been observing him more carefully than he'd realized. Just thinking about work, about the woman on the sailboat. It wasn't a question. Avery had inherited her mother's unsettling ability to read his moods like weather patterns, sensing storms before they broke. Jake looked up from the engine manual he'd been pretending to study. "She's just a customer with a technical problem." "Uh-huh." Avery settled onto a stack of life preservers, adjusting her recorder settings with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to capture conversations that adults thought weren't being monitored. "She's been watching the house." "What do you mean?" "When I was hanging laundry this morning, I could feel her looking." "Not creepy looking," she added quickly, seeing his protective instincts flare. "More like studying. The way you look at an engine before you start working on it, trying to understand how all the pieces fit together." The observation was more accurate than Avery could know. Emma had indeed been watching their small family dynamic with the intensity of someone trying to decode something important. But what could a mysterious sailor possibly want to understand about a widowed mechanic and his teenage daughter? "Maybe she's just curious about local life," Jake said, though even as he spoke the words they felt inadequate. "Some cruising sailors get lonely after weeks at sea." "Dad," Avery's tone carried the exasperated patience of a teenager dealing with an obtuse adult. "She's not a tourist. Her boat has been lived on hard. I can see it from here, the way the deck hardware is arranged, how the lines are coiled, even how she moves around the cockpit. She's not exploring the coast for fun. She's traveling because she has to." Jake stared at his daughter, once again amazed by her observational skills. At 17, Beverly had developed the kind of analytical thinking that would have made her a formidable investigative journalist. Her podcast work had sharpened an already keen eye for inconsistencies and hidden motivations. "What makes you think she has to travel?" "Body language, mostly. When she looks at the harbor, she's not seeing a pretty place to visit. She's evaluating it, exit routes, sight lines, how quickly she could leave if she needed to. I've seen the same thing in interview subjects who've been through trauma. They're always unconsciously planning escape routes." The accuracy of Avery's assessment sent a chill down Jake's spine. If his daughter could read Emma's defensive positioning so clearly, what else might she have noticed? And more importantly, what kind of trouble was Emma Parker running from that required such constant vigilance? "Avery, I need you to promise me something," he said, setting aside the manual and giving her his full attention. "Stay away from her boat for now. Be polite if she approaches you, but don't go looking for conversation." "You think she's dangerous?" "I think she's complicated, and we've had enough complications for one lifetime." Avery studied his face with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "This is about Uncle Ryan, isn't it? Something about her reminds you of what happened to him." The insight hit closer to home than Jake was comfortable admitting. Ryan's death had taught him to be suspicious of coincidences, to question official explanations, to recognize when powerful people were lying to protect their interests. Emma Parker might not be connected to Blackstone Marine Corp, but she carried herself like someone who'd learned the same hard lessons about institutional betrayal and personal vulnerability. "Uncle Ryan died in an industrial accident," Jake said, repeating the official explanation he'd never quite believed. "This is completely different." "But you don't believe that." Avery's voice was gentle but relentless. You've never believed the official story about Uncle Ryan. I've heard you on the phone with lawyers asking questions about workplace safety violations and corporate liability. You think someone killed him. The blunt statement hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake had worked hard to shield Avery from his darker suspicions about Ryan's death, but apparently he'd been less successful than he'd imagined. His daughter's investigative instincts had picked up on the same inconsistencies that had haunted him for 5 years. What I think doesn't matter, he said finally. Ryan is gone and we can't bring him back. Our job is to take care of each other and build a good life here in Moonrise Harbor. But what if we could get justice for him? What if there was evidence that proved Avery? Jake's voice carried a warning that made her fall silent. Some fights aren't worth having. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. I won't risk losing you the way I lost your mother and uncle. She nodded reluctantly, but he could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. Avery had inherited the Brennan family's stubborn streak, along with their mechanical aptitude and protective instincts. Telling her to drop a mystery was like telling the tide to stop turning. It might work temporarily, but the fundamental forces involved were too strong to suppress indefinitely. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the pier. Through the garage's open door, they could see Emma Parker approaching with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision. She'd changed from her sailing clothes into dark jeans and a green sweater that matched her eyes, making her look less like a fugitive and more like someone seeking ordinary human connection. "Mr. Brennan," she called. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Jake stepped outside, acutely aware of Avery following close behind, despite his earlier warnings. "Not at all. How can I help you?" "I wanted to return this." Emma held out a wrench he'd left aboard her sailboat during the morning's diagnostic work. "And I was hoping we could discuss the repair timeline in more detail." "Of course. Please come in." Emma's eyes immediately found Avery, and Jake watched as she shifted into a different mode, warmer, more accessible, the kind of careful adult behavior designed to put young people at ease. "You must be Mr. Brennan's daughter." "I'm Emma Parker." "Avery Brennan, nice to meet you." Avery stepped forward with the cautious politeness she reserved for adults she wasn't sure about yet. "Dad says you're having engine trouble. Nothing too serious, I hope. Your father seems very knowledgeable." Emma's smile appeared genuine, but Jake noticed how her gaze cataloged details of the garage tools equipment, the small office space where he kept his records and marine radio. "He's the best mechanic on the coast," Avery said with the fierce loyalty of a daughter who'd watched her father struggle to build a business while raising her alone. "He learned from my grandfather, who learned from his father. 3 generations of Brennans fixing boats in Moonrise Harbor. That's an impressive legacy. I imagine you know every boat in the harbor." "Most of them. Dad taught me to recognize different engine sounds, hull designs, how to tell if someone knows what they're doing by watching how they handle their boat." Avery's tone was casual, but Jake recognized the subtle probing technique she'd developed for her podcast interviews. Emma's expression flickered with something that might have been admiration or concern. "You're very observant. That's a valuable skill." "Avery's working on a podcast about local mysteries," Jake said, hoping to redirect the conversation before his daughter's curiosity led them into dangerous territory. "She's quite the investigative journalist." "Really, what kind of mysteries?" "Mostly environmental stuff," Avery said, warming to one of her favorite subjects. "Chemical spills that don't get properly investigated, industrial accidents, where the official explanations don't make sense, that sort of thing. People think small coastal towns are boring, but there's actually a lot of interesting stories if you know how to look." Jake watched Emma's face carefully during this exchange, noting how her careful composure seemed to slip slightly. When Avery mentioned industrial accidents and inadequate investigations, something shifted in Emma's expression, a recognition or resonance that confirmed his growing suspicion that her arrival in Moonrise Harbor was more than coincidental. "That sounds like important work," Emma said quietly. "Sometimes the truth gets buried under official explanations that are designed to protect powerful interests rather than serve justice." The statement was casual enough, but it carried undercurrents that made Jake's protective instincts flare. Emma Parker wasn't just making conversation. She was testing them, gauging their attitudes toward the institutional authority and corporate accountability. The question was why. "Well," Jake said, stepping slightly between Emma and Avery, "we should probably discuss those engine repairs. The diagnostic work will take most of tomorrow, and I'll have a better sense of the timeline once I've traced those sensor issues. Emma nodded, recognizing the subtle dismissal. Of course. I don't want to keep you from your work. She turned to Avery with that same careful warmth. It was lovely meeting you. I hope I'll have a chance to hear about your podcast sometime. I'd like that, Avery replied, and Jake could hear the genuine interest in her voice. Despite his warnings, his daughter was already drawn to the mysterious sailor with the modified engine and carefully guarded secrets. As Emma walked back toward her sailboat, Jake found himself torn between curiosity and caution. Every instinct told him that Emma Parker represented the kind of complication he had spent 4 years learning to avoid. But another part of him, the part that had never quite accepted Ryan's death as a simple accident, recognized something in her watchful intensity that resonated with his own long-suppressed questions about corporate power and institutional justice. The storm clouds that had been gathering over the coastal mountains finally released their burden, sending the first fat raindrops spattering against the garage roof. As Jake watched Emma disappear into her sailboat's cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that the weather change was symbolic of larger shifts approaching his carefully ordered world. Tomorrow he would begin the engine repairs that would either send Emma Parker safely on her way or draw him deeper into whatever shadows she was running from. Either way, Jake sensed that the quiet life he'd built in Moonrise Harbor was about to become significantly more complicated. 3 days into the engine diagnostic work, Jake was deep in Emma's sailboat engine compartment when his fingers found something that shouldn't have been there. Tucked beneath a panel housing the fuel injection system, secured with marine tape and wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a small external hard drive that bore a label he recognized with devastating clarity. R. Brennan, Blackstone Safety Records, backup copy. The drive felt impossibly heavy in his palm, a ghost made manifest in the confined space below deck. Ryan's careful block lettering stared back at him from the yellowed label, and Jake's hands began to shake as the implications crashed over him like a rogue wave. His brother had hidden evidence in Emma's boat, or Emma had Ryan's evidence in her possession. Either way, the mysterious sailor upstairs was connected to Blackstone Marine Corps and Ryan's death in ways that made Jake's chest tight with a mixture of hope and rage. For 5 years, he'd lived with unanswered questions. The official investigation had concluded that Ryan Brennan died due to operator error, a chemical exposure incident caused by failure to follow safety protocols. The company had paid a modest settlement to avoid publicity, and the case had been closed within 4 months. But Jake had never believed the official story. Ryan had been safety-obsessed, the kind of worker who double-checked every procedure and never took shortcuts. The idea that he would deliberately bypass protective systems was absurd. Now holding physical evidence that his brother had been investigating Blackstone's safety records, Jake felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about Emma Parker. "Everything all right down there?" Emma's voice drifted down from the cockpit, casual and concerned. Jake's pulse hammered against his throat as he considered his options. He could confront her immediately, demand explanations that might send her fleeing before he learned the truth. Or he could play it carefully, gathering the information while maintaining the pretense of routine engine work. "Just found something interesting," he called back, slipping the drive into his pocket with hands that felt disconnected from his body. "I'll be up in a minute." He forced himself to complete the sensor replacement, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from devastating to miraculous. Emma Parker wasn't just a mysterious sailor seeking refuge. She was somehow connected to Ryan's death, to the corporate conspiracy he died investigating. The question was whether she was an ally carrying evidence that could finally bring justice, or part of the cover-up that had stolen his brother's life. When Jake climbed back up to the deck, Emma was sitting in the cockpit with a mug of coffee and a tablet computer. She looked up as he emerged, and he caught something in her expression, a flicker of watchfulness that suggested she knew exactly what he'd found and had been waiting for this moment. "Sensor replaced," he said, settling into the seat across from her. The harbor stretched around them, busy with the afternoon routines of working boats and weekend sailors, but Jake felt isolated from the familiar world by the weight of the drive in his pocket. "I need to run some calibration tests, but the intermittent power loss should be resolved." "Thank you. You've been very thorough." Emma's voice carried undertones that had nothing to do with engine repairs. "I imagine working on boats gives you insights into their history. The places they've been, the people who've owned them." It was an opening, carefully constructed but unmistakable. Jake pulled the hard drive from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Emma's face went completely still, the color draining from her cheeks as she stared at the label bearing his brother's name. "That's my brother," Jake said quietly. "He died 5 years ago in an accident at Blackstone Marine Corp. According to the company, he made a mistake that cost him his life. What I want to know is why his backup drive was hidden in your engine compartment." Emma stared at the drive as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a depth of pain that matched his own, and Jake realized that whatever her connection to Ryan, it wasn't something she'd entered into lightly. "I was hoping you'd never have to know about this," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of wind and water against the hull. "Know about what?" Emma was quiet for so long that Jake began to wonder if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her words came slowly, each one carefully chosen as if she were diffusing a bomb with syllables. "Your brother didn't make a mistake, Jake. He was murdered." The statement hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd suspected had lived with nagging doubts for 5 years, but hearing it stated so baldly made the harbor seem to tilt around him. The comfortable world of mechanical problems and predictable solutions suddenly felt as insubstantial as morning fog. "How do you know that?" "Because I'm the reason he's dead." Emma stood abruptly and walked to the rail, her back to him. Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful control that was barely holding her together. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, but edged with self-recrimination that cut through the afternoon air like broken glass. "My real name is Dr. Sophia Cross. 5 years ago, I was Chief Safety Inspector for Blackstone Marine Corps. I developed the chemical processing protocols that your brother was working with when he died." Jake felt something cold and sharp unfold in his chest. The woman he'd been growing to trust, maybe even care about, was connected to the company that had killed Ryan. More than connected, she'd helped design the systems that had taken his brother's life. "You worked for Blackstone. I worked for them, and I believed in what we were doing. Environmental responsibility, sustainable ocean resource management, all the corporate buzzwords that made it easy to ignore the corners we were cutting." She turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your brother discovered that the safety protocols I designed were being deliberately circumvented to increase production speed. He was going to report it. So they killed him. They made it look like an accident, but Ryan had been asking questions, pushing for investigations. He'd found evidence that the company was falsifying safety data, exposing workers to dangerous chemicals to meet production quotas." Sophia's voice grew stronger, more controlled. "He was going to blow the whistle, so they silenced him and made it look like his own carelessness." Jake stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of what she was telling him. Ryan hadn't just died in an accident, he'd been murdered for trying to protect other workers. And the woman sitting across from him had been part of the system that killed him. "Why should I believe you?" "Because I have proof." Sophia disappeared below deck and returned with a laptop computer. "After Ryan died, I started investigating. What I found made me realize that Blackstone wasn't just cutting corners. They were systematically covering up industrial accidents, bribing inspectors, falsifying environmental data. They were a criminal organization masquerading as a marine resource company." She opened the laptop and showed him a screen full of documents and technical diagrams. Even from a distance, Jake could see references to chemical processing systems, safety protocols, and incident reports. 5 years of meticulous investigation compressed into digital evidence that could topple a corporate empire. "This goes far beyond industrial accidents," Sophia continued, scrolling through the files. "Environmental contamination, bribery of government officials, systematic intimidation of communities that tried to resist their operations. Blackstone isn't just a marine corporation. They're a criminal enterprise that happens to process fish and extract ocean resources." Jake studied the screen, trying to comprehend the scope of institutional evil Sophia had uncovered. Ryan's death was horrific, but it was just one incident in a pattern of systematic murder and environmental destruction that stretched back years. "How many other people know about this?" "Just me until now. I've been operating alone since I left Blackstone, partly for security reasons and partly because I didn't know who could be trusted. Corporate influence reaches into regulatory agencies, law enforcement, even environmental organizations that should have been fighting them. The isolation in Sophia's voice was palpable. 5 years of carrying this burden alone, living in constant fear, watching from the shadows as Blackstone continued to destroy lives and communities. No wonder she looked haunted. What made you finally decide to surface? Two things. First, I intercepted communications suggesting they're planning to expand operations into protected wilderness areas along the Alaska coast. Millions of acres that would be permanently destroyed if they're allowed to proceed. Sophia's finger traced patterns on the laptop's edge, a nervous gesture that spoke of barely controlled emotion. Second, they're getting close to finding me. My electronic security measures are sophisticated, but they have unlimited resources and government connections. It's only a matter of time before they track me down. Jake looked down at Ryan's hard drive, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew. His brother had been killed not for making a mistake, but for trying to prevent other workers from dying in the same systematic negligence that Blackstone used to maximize profits. Why do you have Ryan's backup drive? I took it from his workstation after the funeral, along with his safety reports, his correspondence with supervisors, anything that might serve as evidence someday. Sophia's voice broke slightly. I've been carrying pieces of your brother with me for 5 years, waiting for the chance to get justice for him and all the others. Others? Ryan wasn't the first and he wasn't the last. I have documentation of at least 18 cases where employees died under suspicious circumstances after raising safety concerns. Blackstone has been covering up worker deaths for over a decade. Jake felt a surge of rage so intense it made his vision blur. 18 people, 18 families destroyed by corporate greed and systematic murder. Ryan had been just one name on a list of inconvenient employees who'd been silenced to protect profit margins. Why come here? Why risk exposing yourself? Sophia gestured toward the engine compartment where he'd found the drive. Because the modifications you've been working on aren't just for efficiency. I've been using this sailboat to gather evidence from Blackstone facilities all along the Pacific coast. Environmental sampling, surveillance footage, intercepted communications, everything I need to prove their crimes. And they know you're getting close. The engine problems weren't just mechanical failure. They were sabotage. Blackstone's security people found me in Newport 2 weeks ago and tried to disable the boat. I managed to get away, but the damage forced me to seek repairs. Jake looked at Sophia with new understanding. She wasn't just running from corporate mariers or investigators. She was being hunted by people who'd already killed to protect their secrets. Coming to Moonrise Harbor had been an act of desperation, not choice. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the harbor, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Around them, the daily rhythms of small-town life continued in blissful ignorance of the corporate conspiracy that had reached into their quiet community. But for Jake, everything had changed. The mysterious sailor he'd been drawn to was carrying evidence that could finally bring justice for Ryan's death. And more than that, she was someone who'd sacrificed everything in pursuit of truth, someone who understood the cost of fighting institutional evil and had never stopped believing that justice was possible. That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table with Ryan's hard drive connected to his laptop, staring at files that painted a picture of systematic corporate evil that made his stomach clench. Sophia had given him the password Ryan's birthday followed by justice, and the contents were devastating. Incident reports that had never been filed with regulatory agencies. Internal memos discussing the acceptable cost of worker casualties. Email chains where executives calculated whether it was cheaper to improve safety systems or pay wrongful death settlements. But it was the personal folder that broke his heart. Ryan had been documenting everything with the methodical persistence of someone who understood he was gathering evidence that could cost him his life. Photos of safety violations, recordings of supervisors pressuring workers to bypass protective protocols, a journal where he'd written, "If something happens to me, make sure Jake knows this wasn't an accident. The truth is in the backup drives. Don't let them bury this with me." Jake's hands shook as he read his brother's final entry, dated 3 days before his death. Meeting with Dr. Cross tomorrow to discuss findings. She's the only one in management who seems to care about worker safety. If anyone can help expose this, it's her. Finally feel like someone in authority is listening. The irony was devastating. Ryan had trusted Sophia, had seen her as an ally in his fight for workplace safety. He died believing that help was coming, never knowing that his faith in corporate leadership was both his salvation and his doom. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Avery appeared in the kitchen doorway, studying him with the penetrating gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "Dad, you look like someone died." The words hit closer to home than she could know. Someone had died, multiple someones, and the evidence was scattered across his laptop screen in files that documented years of corporate murder, disguised as industrial accidents. "Just reviewing some technical specifications," he said, closing the laptop quickly. "How's the podcast research coming?" Avery slid into the chair across from him, her artist's eye taking in details he wished he could hide. She'd always been perceptive, but losing her mother had sharpened that awareness into something almost uncomfortable. She could read his moods like weather patterns, sensing storms before they broke. "Dad, who is she really?" Avery's question was direct, cutting through his attempt at deflection with surgical precision. "What do you mean, Emma Parker? The woman on the sailboat, she's not just a customer, is she? You've been different since she arrived. More focused, but also more worried. Like you're trying to solve a problem that's bigger than engine repairs." Jake studied his daughter's face, wondering how much she'd already figured out. Avery had inherited the Brennan family's investigative instincts along with their mechanical aptitude. Trying to hide a mystery from her was like trying to contain the tide. "It's complicated, honey, adult stuff that I'm still trying to understand myself." "Does it have something to do with Uncle Ryan?" The question hit like a punch to the chest. Jake had worked hard to shield Avery from his darker suspicions about Ryan's death, but apparently he'd been less successful than he'd imagined. His daughter's investigative instincts had picked up on the same inconsistencies that had haunted him for 5 years. Before he could answer, another knock came at the front door. Through the window, Jake could see Sophia standing on the porch, her posture apologetic but determined. She'd changed from her sailing clothes into dark jeans and a blue sweater that made her eyes look deeper, more troubled. "That's her, isn't it?" Avery said, reading his expression. "She's here to talk about Uncle Ryan." Jake opened the door, acutely aware of his daughter listening from the kitchen. "Sophia, is everything all right?" "I wanted to return this," she said, holding out a marine manual he had left aboard her sailboat. "And I was hoping we could talk more about what you found today. There are things you need to understand before you decide what to do with that evidence." Jake stepped aside to let her in, noting how Sophia's eyes immediately found Avery. The careful warmth from their earlier meetings was still there, but underneath it was something more complex, a recognition of shared loss that spoke to experiences deeper than casual conversation. "Avery, this is Dr. Sophia Cross." "Sophia, my daughter Avery." "We met the other day," Avery said, standing with the cautious politeness she reserved for adults she wasn't sure about yet. "You said your name was Emma Parker." Sophia's expression flickered with something that might have been shame or regret. "I did. I've been using that name for several years now, for protection." "Protection from what?" Jake saw Sophia glance at him, seeking permission or guidance about how much truth a 17-year-old could handle. But Avery had already picked up on the undercurrents of their conversation, and her investigative instincts were fully engaged. "Avery," Jake said carefully, "Dr. Cross has information about Uncle Ryan's death. Information that suggests the official investigation wasn't complete." His daughter's eyes widened, but her expression remained steady. "You mean someone lied about what happened to him?" "That's exactly what I mean." Sophia stepped forward, her voice gentle but direct. "Your uncle was investigating safety violations at the company where he worked. People in power didn't want those violations exposed, so they silenced him and made it look like an accident." Avery absorbed this information with the kind of calm intensity that reminded Jake painfully of Ryan. "Do you have proof?" "Yes. Your uncle gathered extensive documentation before he died. Evidence that could hold his killers accountable and prevent future deaths." "Then why haven't you used it?" It was a simple question, but it cut to the heart of Sophia's 5-year struggle with institutional corruption and personal survival. Jake watched as she chose her words carefully, speaking to Avery as an intelligent young adult rather than a child who needed protection from difficult truths. Because the people responsible have enormous resources and government connections. They've been covering up industrial murders for years, and they're very good at making problems disappear. "I've been gathering additional evidence while staying hidden, waiting for the right moment to expose everything. And now you think that moment has come? Now I think I'm running out of time. They're closing in on my location, and if they find me before I can release the evidence, your uncle's killers will never face justice." Avery was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that would have overwhelmed most teenagers. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Jake of both Ryan and her mother. "What do you need us to do?" The question caught both adults off guard. Jake had been struggling with whether to involve himself in Sophia's dangerous mission, but his daughter had immediately jumped to practical action. It was exactly the kind of response Ryan would have given when faced with injustice. "Avery," Jake said, "this isn't something for you to worry about. Dr. Cross and I need to discuss." "Dad." His daughter's voice carried the patient exasperation of someone dealing with an obtuse adult. "Uncle Ryan was my family too. If someone murdered him and covered it up, I want them held accountable. Besides," she gestured toward her digital recorder, "I've been investigating corporate cover-ups for months. I might actually be able to help." Sophia looked between Jake and his daughter, clearly recognizing the family resemblance that went beyond physical appearance. "Your uncle would be proud of both of you. He always talked about his family, about how much he loved his brother and niece." "You knew him personally?" Jake asked. "I worked with him for almost 2 years before his death. He was one of the most dedicated safety advocates I'd ever encountered, passionate about protecting his fellow workers, meticulous in his documentation, absolutely fearless when it came to confronting dangerous practices." Sophia's voice grew warm with genuine affection. "He talked about you constantly, Jake. How proud he was of your mechanical skills, how you'd taken over the family business and made it thrive. And Avery, he showed everyone pictures of your art projects, your good grades, your independence." Tears stung Jake's eyes as he imagined Ryan bragging about his family to colleagues who would later help cover up his murder. He never mentioned problems at work, never said anything about safety concerns or corporate pressure. He was trying to protect you. Ryan knew that Blackstone had a history of retaliating against employees who caused trouble. He didn't want to put his family at risk until he had enough evidence to ensure the company couldn't suppress the truth. "But he trusted you," Avery said, her investigative instincts picking up on details that painted a larger picture. "He thought you were going to help him expose the safety violations." Sophia's composure cracked, revealing depths of guilt and self-recrimination that she'd been carrying for 5 years. "He did trust me, and I failed him. I was supposed to meet with him the day after he died to review his evidence and plan how to present it to federal regulators. Instead, I got a call saying he'd been killed in an industrial accident caused by operator error." "What did you do?" "Initially, I believed the official story. Ryan was just one worker among hundreds, and industrial accidents happen even in well-regulated facilities. It wasn't until I started reviewing his safety reports more carefully that I realized something was wrong. The incident descriptions didn't match the physical evidence. The timeline made no sense. And when I started asking questions, my supervisor told me to drop the matter and focus on other projects." Jake could see the progression of Sophia's awakening to corporate corruption playing out in her expression. The gradual recognition that institutions she'd trusted were actively covering up criminal behavior. The terrible realization that her own work had been used to facilitate murder. "That's when you started investigating on your own." "That's when I realized that Ryan's death was part of a much larger pattern. I began reviewing other accidents that had occurred over the previous decade. What I found was systematic murder disguised as workplace negligence. Employees who raised safety concerns would die in accidents that were subsequently blamed on their own carelessness." "How many?" Avery asked. 18 confirmed cases, possibly more. Workers who died after filing safety complaints, requesting equipment inspections, or threatening to contact federal agencies. All ruled accidental deaths caused by operator error, all resulting in modest settlements and closed investigations. The magnitude of the conspiracy was overwhelming. Jake tried to imagine 18 families like his own grieving loved ones, while being told they died through their own mistakes. 18 murders covered up by corporate influence and regulatory capture. "When did you decide to become a whistleblower?" "When I realized that reform from within was impossible. I tried working through proper channels, filing reports, requesting meetings with senior management, even contacting federal agencies directly. Every attempt was blocked, buried, or dismissed. The corruption went too deep to fix through normal means." So you stole evidence and disappeared. I copied everything I could access and left the company before they could silence me the way they'd silenced Ryan and the others. I've been gathering additional evidence ever since building a case that's too comprehensive for them to suppress or discredit. Avery leaned forward with the intense focus she brought to her podcast interviews. What kind of additional evidence? Environmental contamination data they have hidden from federal agencies, financial records showing bribes to inspectors and politicians, audio recordings of executives discussing which employees posed risks to corporate operations. Everything needed to prove that Blackstone Marine Corps is a criminal enterprise that's been operating with impunity for years. Jake felt the weight of Ryan's hard drive in his pocket, understanding now that his brother's evidence was just one piece of a much larger mosaic of corporate crime. Sophia had been building a case that could bring down not just Ryan's killers, but an entire system of institutional corruption that had claimed dozens of lives. "Why haven't you released it already?" he asked. "Because I needed to be sure it was complete and irrefutable. Corporate defense attorneys are experts at creating reasonable doubt, discrediting whistleblowers, and shifting blame to individual employees. I wanted evidence so overwhelming that no amount of legal maneuvering could protect the guilty. And now you have it." Sophia's smile was sharp as winter wind off the Pacific. "Now I have enough evidence to destroy them completely. Financial crimes, environmental violations, systematic murder, everything needed to send Blackstone's entire executive structure to federal prison for the rest of their lives." Looking at his daughter's determined expression and thinking about Ryan's final journal entry, Jake felt something shift inside his chest. For 5 years, he'd carried questions that had no answers, grief that had no outlet, rage that had no target. Now finally, he had the chance to honor his brother's sacrifice and ensure that his death had meaning. "What do you need from us?" he asked. The revelation that Sophia had worked for Blackstone Marine Corps hung in the air between them, like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. Jake found himself studying her face, searching for signs of deception or hidden agenda. But all he could see was the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been carrying an impossible burden for too long. "You designed the systems that killed my brother," he said, needing to hear her acknowledge the full scope of her responsibility. "Yes." Sophia's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "I created the chemical processing protocols Blackstone's management later corrupted. I trusted corporate leadership to implement safety measures properly, and that trust cost your brother his life." Avery looked between them with the sharp awareness of someone who understood that this conversation would determine whether their strange alliance could survive the weight of shared tragedy. "But you didn't know they were going to ignore the safety protocols, did you?" "No. I believed I was working for a company that prioritized environmental responsibility and worker safety. When I designed those systems, I included multiple redundancies, fail-safes, and warning mechanisms, specifically to prevent the kind of accident that killed Ryan." Sophia met Jake's eyes directly, not flinching from the pain she saw there. "I was naive about corporate power and how easily good intentions can be perverted when profit margins are threatened." Jake felt the familiar surge of anger that had sustained him through 5 years of unanswered questions, but underneath it was something more complex, a recognition that Sophia's guilt was real and that she'd paid a heavy price for her corporate idealism. She could have walked away after Ryan's death, could have convinced herself that she bore no responsibility for management decisions made above her pay grade. Instead, she'd sacrificed her career, her safety, and her identity to seek justice for people she'd never met. "How do I know you're not still working for them?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, but it needed to be asked. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate setup to find out what Ryan discovered?" Sophia was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. When she finally answered, her voice carried the weight of 5 years spent running from shadows and sleeping with one eye open. "Because if I were still working for Blackstone, your brother's hard drive would never have survived to be found. They've spent considerable resources trying to track down every piece of evidence he gathered. The fact that I've preserved it, along with everything else I've collected, has made me their primary target." She opened her laptop and showed them a screen filled with what looked like surveillance reports and threat assessments. Even reading upside down, Jake could see references to Dr. Sophia Cross and asset recovery operations. that made his blood run cold. "They've been hunting me for 5 years," she continued. "Private investigators, corporate security teams, even the government contractors with connections to federal agencies. I've had to change identities, abandon safe houses, stay constantly mobile to avoid capture. If I were working for them, I'd be sitting in a comfortable office somewhere, not living on a sailboat, and running engine diagnostics in small harbor towns." Avery leaned forward, her podcast interviewing instincts engaged. "What would happen if they caught you?" "At best, I'd disappear into a federal facility somewhere held on trumped-up charges while they destroyed all the evidence I've gathered. At worst," Sophia's smile was grim, "I'd join Ryan and the others on the list of people who died in unfortunate accidents." The casual way she discussed her own potential murder drove home the reality of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a corporate dispute that could be resolved through proper channels. It was a war between institutional power and individual conscience, fought in shadows by people who'd learned that the legal system was just another weapon in the hands of those wealthy enough to purchase justice. Jake found himself thinking about Ryan's final journal entry, his brother's faith that Dr. Cross would help expose the truth. Ryan had trusted her, had seen something in her character that transcended corporate loyalty. Maybe it was time to trust his brother's judgment. "If we help you," Jake said slowly, "what guarantee do we have that you won't disappear again once the evidence is released? What's to stop you from vanishing and leaving us to deal with Blackstone's retaliation?" It was Sophia's turn to study his face, searching for something that would help her gauge whether honesty was safe or dangerous. "You don't have any guarantees, Jake. I can't promise that helping me won't put you and Avery at risk. Blackstone has a long history of targeting the families of people who oppose them. But I can promise that I'm done running. I'm tired of living in fear, tired of watching them hurt people while I hide in the shadows with evidence that could stop them. Your brother died believing that justice was possible. I want to honor that faith." Avery had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus she brought to her most important podcast interviews. "Dad," she said quietly, "Uncle Ryan trusted her, and she's been fighting for him for 5 years, even when she could have just walked away and been safe." Jake looked at his daughter, amazed once again by her ability to cut through complex emotions and identify fundamental truths. Avery was right. Sophia could have disappeared completely after leaving. Blackstone could have assumed a new identity and built a quiet life somewhere they'd never find her. Instead, she'd chosen to carry Ryan's evidence, along with her guilt, waiting for the chance to seek justice despite the personal cost. "Okay," he said, feeling something shift in his chest, so he made the decision. "Ryan trusted you, and Avery's right. You've proven your commitment by risking everything to gather this evidence. What do you need from us?" Relief flooded Sophia's face like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "Time mostly, and technical assistance. I need to upload terabytes of evidence simultaneously to multiple servers and news organizations. That requires high-speed internet access and security measures that I can't implement alone." "The community center has fiber optic internet," Avery said immediately. "Iris Fletcher runs the computer lab there, and she used to be an investigative journalist before she became our librarian. If anyone would understand what we're trying to do, it's her." Jake nodded, his mechanical mind already working through the logistical challenges. How long would the upload take? 6 to 8 hours for the complete database. But the critical evidence, Ryan's files, the murder documentation, the financial crimes, could be transmitted in the first 2 hours. Enough to trigger investigations, even if we're interrupted. And Blackstone's response? Sophia's expression grew serious, swift, and probably violent. Once they realize what's happening, they'll mobilize every resource to stop the transmission and eliminate anyone involved. We're not just exposing corporate crimes, we're threatening the livelihood and freedom of some very powerful people who've already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Jake thought about Avery, about the quiet life they'd built in Moonrise Harbor, about all the ways this could go wrong. Then he thought about Ryan's journal entry, his brother's faith that the truth would eventually prevail, and the 18 families who'd never received justice for their murdered loved ones. When do we start? Later that evening, after Avery had gone to bed with strict instructions to stay away from the harbor until their plans were finalized, Jake found himself walking the pier with Sophia. The spring air was crisp with the promise of rain, and the harbor lights reflected off the water like scattered stars. It was the kind of evening that usually brought Jake peace, but tonight his mind churned with everything he'd learned about corporate conspiracy and systemic murder. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, he said as they approached the end of the pier, where Emma Sophia had first moored her sailboat 3 days ago, about being the reason Ryan died. You weren't responsible for management decisions to ignore safety protocols. Sophia leaned against the pier, railing her profile sharp against the harbor lights. Intellectually, I know that, but I designed those systems with absolute faith in corporate responsibility. I never imagined that executives would deliberately endanger workers to save money. That naivety makes me complicit in everything that followed. Ryan wouldn't have seen it that way. Jake joined her at the railing, noting how the ocean breeze carried her scent salt air and something floral that reminded him of the wild roses that grew along the coastal cliffs. He believed in people doing their best work with good intentions. He would have understood that you were trying to create something positive. Would he, Sophia's voice carried years of self-doubt and second-guessing, or would he have seen me as just another corporate executive who prioritized profits over people? Jake studied her profile, seeing past the careful defenses to the woman who'd sacrificed everything in pursuit of justice for people she'd never met. He would have seen exactly what I see: someone who took responsibility for her mistakes and spent 5 years trying to make them right. Someone brave enough to risk her life to honor the memory of workers she couldn't save. Sophia turned to look at him, and Jake caught his breath at the vulnerability in her expression. The careful distance she maintained during daylight hours had dissolved, revealing someone who'd been alone with her guilt and determination for too long. I dream about them sometimes, she said quietly. Ryan and the others. They're standing in a place I can't reach, waiting for me to keep promises I made to their memory. When I wake up, I can still feel their disappointment that justice is taking so long. Without thinking, Jake reached out to cover her hand with his. Her skin was cool from the ocean air, but he could feel the warmth underneath the pulse that proved she was alive and present despite the ghost that haunted her. They wouldn't be disappointed, he said. They'd be grateful that someone cared enough to remember their names and fight for the truth. Ryan especially. He always said that the hardest part of his job wasn't the physical danger. It was knowing that if something happened to him, the safety violations would continue and more people would get hurt. Sophia's fingers intertwined with his, and Jake felt something shift between them, a recognition that their shared loss had created a connection deeper than mere alliance. They were two people who'd lost someone to corporate greed, who understood the weight of carrying responsibility for others' safety. I'm scared, Jake. The admission came so quietly he almost missed it. Not of dying, I made peace with that possibility years ago. I'm scared of failing again. Of having all this evidence and not being able to use it effectively. Of Ryan's death remaining meaningless. Jake turned to face her, fully studying the way harbor lights caught the gold in her hair and made her eyes look deeper than the ocean itself. His death already has meaning. You've given it meaning by refusing to let it be forgotten. And tomorrow, when we upload that evidence, 18 families will finally learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones. If we succeed, we'll succeed. Jake surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. Blackstone might have money and government connections, but they don't have what we have, which is the truth, and people who care more about justice than personal safety. He squeezed her hand gently. Plus, they're underestimating us. Corporate executives don't expect small-town mechanics and teenage podcasters to pose serious threats to their operations. Sophia laughed, the first genuinely carefree sound he'd heard from her since they'd met. Your daughter is remarkable, by the way. I've interviewed dozens of potential witnesses over the years, and most adults are too intimidated by corporate power to get involved. But Avery immediately jumped to practical action. She gets that from her mother, Jake said, feeling the familiar ache of missing his wife, but also gratitude for the qualities Sarah had passed on to their daughter. And from Ryan, he always said that talking about problems was fine, but actually solving them required getting your hands dirty. Is that your philosophy too? Jake considered the question, thinking about the past 4 years of careful routine and risk avoidance that had defined his life since Sarah's death. It used to be. I think I've been playing it safe since I lost Sarah, trying to protect what I had left, instead of fighting for what I believed in. And now I'm remembering that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds are terrible. He met her eyes directly, seeing his own determination reflected there. Ryan's justice, the truth about corporate corruption, making sure other families don't go through what we've gone through. Sophia was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could feel something building between them, an awareness that transcended their shared mission and moved into more personal territory. When she finally spoke, her voice carried notes he hadn't heard before, warmer and more vulnerable than the careful control she usually maintained. I haven't let myself get close to anyone since I left Blackstone. It seemed unfair to involve someone else in the danger I was carrying. But being here working with you and Avery, feeling like part of a family again. She trailed off, looking uncertain about how much honesty was safe. Sophia. Jake's voice was gentle but direct. I haven't felt this connected to anyone since Sarah died. I know the timing is terrible and the circumstances are dangerous, but I want you to know that what's developing between us isn't just about shared trauma or temporary alliance. What is it about, Jake thought, about the question, searching for words that could capture the complexity of what he was feeling? It's about recognizing someone whose courage matches their compassion, someone who's proven that they're willing to sacrifice everything for principles that matter, someone who makes me want to be the kind of man Ryan believed I could be. Sophia stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes and feel the warmth radiating from her body despite the cool ocean air. Jake, I need you to understand something. When this is over, assuming we both survive it, my life is going to change completely. I'll probably have to testify in federal trials, relocate somewhere Blackstone can't reach me, start over again with a new identity. I can't ask you and Avery to give up your life here for someone you've known less than a week. You're not asking, Jake said, reaching up to touch her face gently. But if you were the answer, would it be yes? Home isn't a place, it's people who matter enough to fight for. And somehow in the space of 3 days, you've become someone worth fighting for. Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. The contact was soft, at first tentative, but when she kissed him back, with 5 years of suppressed longing and desperate hope, it deepened into something that spoke of shared loss and the possibility of new beginnings built on foundation of truth and justice. When they finally broke apart, Sophia rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard from more than just the ocean air. Tomorrow changes everything, she whispered. Then tonight we hold on to this, Jake replied, pulling her closer as the harbor lights danced around them, like promises of better days ahead. The next morning brought clear skies and the kind of crisp Pacific air that usually filled Jake with optimism about the day ahead. But as he sat in Sophia's sailboat cabin, surrounded by 5 years of accumulated evidence against Blackstone Marine Corp., the beautiful weather felt like a cruel contrast to the darkness they were preparing to expose. Sophia had spread documents across every available surface, printed emails, financial records, scientific reports, and photograph after photograph of environmental damage that had been systematically covered up. Her laptop displayed a database that looked like something from a federal prosecutor's office, with categories for worker deaths, environmental crimes, regulatory capture, and financial fraud. The scope is bigger than I originally told you, Sophia said, highlighting a timeline that stretched back 15 years. What started as workplace safety violations has evolved into something approaching organized crime. Blackstone isn't just cutting corners, they're operating a criminal enterprise that corrupts everything it touches. Jake studied a printed email chain between Blackstone executives discussing problem employees who needed to be managed before they could cause operational disruptions. The clinical language couldn't disguise what they were really discussing: the systematic murder of workers who threatened their profit margins. This one is from 2 weeks before Ryan died, Sophia said, pointing to a message from Victor Kane, Blackstone's chief financial officer. He's ordering plant supervisors to identify employees who filed safety complaints or requested equipment inspections. Ryan's name is on the list. Jake read the email with growing horror. His brother wasn't just mentioned in passing, he was specifically flagged as a Category 1 threat requiring immediate intervention. The bureaucratic euphemisms made the planned murder sound like routine business operations. They discussed killing him in corporate emails. They discussed neutralizing operational risks through standard protocols. But when you cross-reference it with their other communications, the meaning is clear. Sophia opened another folder filled with incident reports. Every person on Kane's threat assessment list died within 6 months of being identified. 23 workers over the past decade, they're all killed in accidents that were subsequently blamed on operator error. The scale of systematic murder was overwhelming. Jake tried to imagine 23 families, like his own grieving loved ones, while being told they died through their own mistakes. 23 funerals where corporate representatives expressed sympathy while knowing they'd ordered the deaths. How did they coordinate the murders without leaving obvious evidence? Compartmentalization and plausible deniability. Kane would identify targets through safety assessments. But plant supervisors would create opportunities for accidents during routine operations. Medical examiners who received Blackstone funding would rule deaths accidental without thorough investigation. Each person in the chain could claim they were just doing their job. Jake picked up one of Ryan's final safety reports, noting his brother's careful documentation of chemical exposure violations and equipment failures. Ryan had been meticulous in his evidence gathering, photographing damaged safety equipment, and recording conversations with supervisors who pressured workers to bypass protective protocols. He knew they were going to kill him, Jake said, reading between the lines of Ryan's increasingly urgent reports. Look at this. He's not just documenting safety violations anymore. He's building a legal case. Your brother was brilliant. He understood that isolated safety complaints could be dismissed or buried, but systematic documentation of criminal negligence would be harder to suppress. Sophia pointed to a folder labeled Federal Backup Copies. He was preparing to submit everything to OSHA, the EPA, and the Justice Department simultaneously. What stopped him? They moved faster than he expected. Ryan had requested a meeting with me to review his evidence and plan the federal submission. They killed him the night before we were supposed to meet. Jake felt rage building in his chest as he imagined his brother's final hours believing that help was coming, while his murderers put their plan into motion. Did you know what he was planning to discuss? Not specifically. I knew he'd requested the meeting to discuss serious safety concerns, but I assumed it was routine workplace issues. If I'd understood the scope of what he'd discovered, I might have been able to protect him. Or they would have killed you both. Sophia was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what might have happened if she'd recognized the danger earlier. The night Ryan died, I received a call from plant security saying there had been an accident. By the time I arrived, the scene had been cleaned up, and the official story was already established. Operator error failure to follow safety protocols, tragic but preventable if proper procedures had been followed. But you knew better. Not immediately. It wasn't until I started reviewing Ryan's safety reports that I realized something was wrong. The incident description didn't match the physical evidence. The chemical exposure patterns were inconsistent with the supposed accident sequence. And when I asked for access to the security footage, I was told it had been corrupted by electromagnetic interference. Jake studied crime scene photographs that showed signs of systematic evidence manipulation. Equipment had been moved, chemical residues had been cleaned away, and witness statements contained identical phrases that suggested coordination rather than independent observation. This is a prosecution manual, he said, understanding the scope of what Sophia had assembled. Financial crimes, environmental violations, systematic murder, everything needed to destroy Blackstone completely. That's the goal. But Jake, you need to understand what we're really up against. Sophia opened a folder labeled Political Connections that contained photographs and financial records showing Blackstone's influence throughout federal and state government. They have senators on their payroll, federal judges who've received campaign contributions, EPA administrators who worked for Blackstone before joining the government. The web of corruption was staggering. Jake counted at least 12 federal officials who'd received significant financial support from Blackstone or its subsidiaries. Environmental regulators who'd approved permits for facilities that were later found to be catastrophically contaminated. Justice Department attorneys who declined to prosecute obvious criminal violations. How do we fight something this big? Volume and simultaneity. If we release everything at once to multiple news organizations, law enforcement agencies, and watchdog groups, they won't be able to suppress it all. Some of these officials might be corrupt, but not all of them. And once the story breaks publicly, the political pressure for accountability becomes overwhelming. Sophia showed him a distribution list that included every major news organization, federal law enforcement agency, and environmental advocacy group in the country. The evidence will be uploaded to secure servers and automatically distributed at scheduled intervals. Even if they stop us, the releases will continue. And Ryan's specific case, here. Sophia opened a subfolder that contained everything related to Ryan's investigation and murder. Video footage from security cameras that hadn't been corrupted. Audio recordings of supervisors discussing plans to resolve the Brennan problem. Financial records showing payments to the medical examiner who'd ruled Ryan's death accidental. Jake's hands shook as he listened to a recording of his brother's supervisor planning the accident that would kill him. The casual tone made it sound like routine maintenance scheduling rather than premeditated murder. "We have them," he said, understanding finally that justice for Ryan wasn't just possible, it was inevitable once this evidence became public. "We have them completely. Kane, the plant supervisors, the medical examiner, even the federal officials who helped cover it up. Everyone who participated in your brother's murder will face federal prosecution." As Jake absorbed the magnitude of what they were preparing to unleash, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Ryan's death: hope. Not just for personal justice, but for systematic change that would prevent future families from enduring what his had suffered. "When do we start?" "Tonight. Iris Fletcher is expecting us at the community center after hours. 6 to 8 hours for the complete upload, but the critical evidence will be transmitted in the first 2 hours." Jake looked around the cabin at 5 years of accumulated proof that corporations could murder workers with impunity if they had enough money and political connections. Tomorrow that impunity would end. Ryan would be proud, he said, thinking about his brother's faith that the truth would eventually prevail. "Tonight he gets the justice he died trying to achieve." Sophia replied, her voice carrying the weight of promises made to the dead and determination to honor their sacrifice. That afternoon, Jake stood at the podium in the Moonrise Harbor Community Center, looking out at 43 faces that represented the heart and soul of his hometown. He'd called an emergency meeting using the harbor's informal communication network word, passed between fishing boats, posted notices at the marina, phone calls to families who'd lived here for generations. The response had exceeded his expectations and confirmed something he'd always known but never fully appreciated: this community took care of its own. Captain Valdez sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded over a chest that had hauled nets through Pacific storms for 30 years. Beside him was Rosa Martinez, who ran the harbor's fuel dock and knew every boat owner's financial troubles before their banks did. Tommy Chen, whose salmon trawler Pacific Dream was considered the most reliable vessel in the fleet, had brought his teenage son Marcus, who was home from community college for spring break. Mrs. Patterson occupied her usual spot near the back next to Elena Vasquez, whose husband had died in a factory accident in California 15 years ago. Different company, similar circumstances. The gathering represented 3 generations of working families who understood that sometimes the only thing standing between them and corporate exploitation was collective action. Iris Fletcher stood beside the community center's computer setup, her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun that made her look more like a librarian than a former investigative journalist who'd covered industrial disasters for the Portland Oregonian for 20 years. At 62, she'd retired to Moonrise Harbor, seeking peace, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd spent decades exposing institutional corruption. "Thank you all for coming on short notice." Jake began, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who'd earned respect through years of honest work. "What I'm about to tell you involves corporate crime, government corruption, and the murder of my brother Ryan. It also involves a chance to fight back against the kind of institutional power that treats working people as expendable." A murmur ran through the assembled crowd. These weren't people who gathered for abstract political discussions. They came together when practical problems required collective solutions: storm damage, economic pressure, threats to their community's survival. Sophia stood from her seat in the second row, and Jake felt a moment of uncertainty about how the community would receive someone who'd worked for the corporate enemy. But when she began to speak, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd sacrificed everything for principles that mattered. "My name is Dr. Sophia Cross. 5 years ago, I worked for Blackstone Marine Corp as Chief Safety Inspector. I discovered that they were systematically murdering workers who reported safety violations. When I tried to expose the crimes through proper channels, I learned that the corruption reached into federal agencies and government oversight committees." Captain Valdez leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. "How many workers are we talking about?" 23 confirmed murders over the past 10 years. Possibly more if we include long-term health effects from deliberate chemical exposure. Sophia's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the emotional toll of recounting these statistics to people who understood the human cost of industrial violence. Elena Vasquez spoke from the back of the room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd fought corporate lawyers and insurance companies over her husband's death. What kind of evidence do you have? Corporate emails ordering the murders, financial records showing bribes to government officials, audio recordings of supervisors planning accidents, security footage that proves the official investigations were fraudulent. Sophia gestured toward Iris Fletcher. Everything needed for federal prosecution if we can get it to people who aren't on Blackstone's payroll. Tommy Chen raised his hand. What does this have to do with Moonrise Harbor? We're a fishing community, not a chemical processing operation. Jake stepped forward, understanding that this was the crucial moment where abstract justice either became personal commitment or remained someone else's problem. It has to do with us because corporate power doesn't respect community boundaries. The same system that killed Ryan and 22 other workers is the same system that tries to dump toxic waste in our fishing grounds, that bribes officials to approve offshore drilling projects, that treats communities like ours as acceptable collateral damage for corporate profits. Besides, Avery's voice came from the side of the room where she'd been operating her podcast recording equipment. Uncle Ryan was family to this community. He grew up here, learned to work on boats in Grandpa's garage, spent summers crewing on fishing boats before he took the job at Blackstone. When they murdered him, they attacked one of our own. The room fell silent as people absorbed this connection between corporate crime and personal loss. These were families who'd known Ryan Brennan since childhood, who'd watched him grow from a curious kid hanging around the harbor to a young man passionate about worker safety. Mrs. Patterson stood slowly, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children in a community where everyone looked out for each other. What do you need from us? Iris Fletcher stepped forward, her journalistic instincts engaged by the story unfolding before her. We need secure internet access for an overnight data upload, multiple terabytes of evidence going to news organizations and federal agencies simultaneously. And we need security people watching for corporate response teams who'll try to stop the transmission. Corporate response teams, Rosa Martinez asked. Private security contractors, Sophia explained. Former military personnel who handle problems that regular corporate lawyers can't resolve. They've been hunting me for 5 years, and they'll escalate to violence once they realize what we're doing. Captain Valdez exchanged glances with Tommy Chen and several other fishing boat captains. A wordless communication passed between them, the kind of silent coordination that came from years of working together in dangerous conditions. How many people are we talking about? Valdez asked. Unknown, could be a small surveillance team, could be a full tactical unit. They have unlimited resources and no moral constraints. Marcus Chen, Tommy's son, spoke up with the confidence of someone who'd studied military history and understood tactical situations. They'll approach by land, probably the main road from Highway 101. The harbor gives us natural defensive advantages if we coordinate properly. Jake looked around the room, seeing the same determination that had sustained Moonrise Harbor. Through economic downturns, environmental disasters, and the constant pressure of corporate development. These weren't people who backed down from fights that mattered. I want to be clear about what I'm asking, he said. This could be dangerous. Blackstone has killed to protect their secrets, and they won't hesitate to escalate if they think we're threatening their survival. Anyone who wants to leave now, no judgment. Nobody moved. If anything, the crowd seemed to settle more firmly into their seats, the way fishing crews did when storm warnings suggested a rough night ahead. Elena Vasquez stood again, her voice carrying 15 years of accumulated anger about corporate impunity. My husband died in a chemical explosion that the company blamed on his carelessness. I spent 3 years fighting their lawyers and the insurance companies, trying to prove they'd ignored safety violations. I never got justice for him. She paused, looking directly at Sophia. If helping you means other families don't go through what I went through, then count me in. One by one, other voices joined the commitment. Tommy Chen offered the use of his boat's advanced electronics for harbor surveillance. Captain Valdez volunteered to coordinate defensive positions around the marina. Rosa Martinez promised to monitor marine radio traffic for unusual activity. But it was Iris Fletcher who provided the crucial element that would make their operation possible. I still have contacts at federal agencies from my journalism days. She said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built relationships across decades of investigative work. FBI agents who aren't on corporate payrolls, environmental prosecutors who've been waiting for a case this big, Justice Department attorneys who understand that institutional corruption requires institutional response. She walked to the computer terminal and began pulling up contact information that represented years of cultivated sources and professional relationships. If we can keep the upload running for 6 hours, I can ensure the evidence reaches people who have the power and integrity to act on it. Jake felt something shift in the room's atmosphere as abstract commitment crystallized into practical planning. This wasn't just about justice for Ryan anymore. It was about a community deciding to fight back against the kind of corporate power that treated working people as expendable. "What's the timeline?" Captain Valdez asked, his mind already moving to operational details. "We start at midnight," Sophia said. "Upload begins immediately. Critical evidence transmits in the first 2 hours. Blackstone's response will probably begin around 2 a.m., escalating through the early morning hours. Sunrise is at 6:20, Marcus Chen added. "If we can hold them until daylight, media attention makes violent suppression much more difficult." Avery raised her hand from her position beside the recording equipment. "I'll be live streaming the entire operation on my podcast platform. Real-time documentation makes it harder for them to claim we were terrorists or criminals if something goes wrong." Jake looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and terror. At 17, she developed the kind of moral courage that most adults never found. But she was also proposing to put herself directly in harm's way for principles that transcended personal safety. "Avery, I don't think, Dad." Her voice carried the patient determination he'd learned to recognize as non-negotiable. "This is exactly the kind of story I've been training to cover. Besides, Uncle Ryan died trying to protect people. I'm not going to honor his memory by hiding in safety while other people fight for justice." The room fell silent again as people absorbed the reality that they were planning to take on a corporation with unlimited resources and a proven willingness to kill. But instead of backing down, the community seemed to draw strength from the magnitude of the challenge. "All right," Jake said, feeling the weight of leadership settle over him, like responsibility for a crew heading into storm waters. "We have 8 hours to prepare. Captain Valdez, can you coordinate harbor defense? Tommy Marcus, can you handle communications and surveillance? Mrs. Patterson, Elena, can you organize supply and medical support?" As the community began organizing itself into functional units, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Ryan's death, the sense that they were finally moving toward justice rather than just away from grief. Tomorrow, 23 families would learn the truth about their murdered loved ones. And if they succeeded, no other families would suffer the same losses to corporate greed and institutional indifference. The battle for Ryan Brennan's justice was about to begin, and it would be fought by people who understood that some principles were worth risking everything to defend. At 1:23 a.m., with the evidence upload 58% complete and Blackstone's vehicles maintaining their ominous perimeter around Moonrise Harbor, everything changed in the space of 30 seconds. "Contact," Marcus Chen's voice crackled across the marine radio with the controlled urgency of someone who'd spotted immediate danger. 4 individuals moving through the South Woods professional gear approaching the community center from the blind side. ETA 3 minutes. Jake grabbed the radio handset, his mind racing through defensive options that suddenly seemed inadequate against professional operators. "Can you get a visual on their equipment?" "Negative on weapons, but they're carrying electronic gear that looks like jamming equipment. They're trying to cut our communications and internet connection." In the community center, Iris Fletcher's fingers flew across her keyboard as warning indicators began flashing on multiple computer terminals. "They're hitting us with targeted electromagnetic interference, trying to disrupt the upload without completely destroying the evidence. Professional-grade cyber warfare." Sophia looked up from her laptop where the upload progress had suddenly slowed to a crawl. "Transmission speed dropping fast. If they maintain this level of interference, we'll need 4 hours to complete the upload instead of 20 minutes. Can you compensate?" "I'm rerouting through backup servers and alternate pathways, but their jamming is sophisticated. Military-grade equipment designed specifically to disrupt data transmissions without causing obvious system failures. Avery adjusted her broadcasting equipment as her live stream audience climbed past 2,000 viewers, many of them sharing the feed across social media platforms in real time. Dad, the interference is affecting my stream quality, but I'm maintaining connection through cellular backup. People are watching this happen live. Jake felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him like water pressure at crushing depth. Every decision could mean the difference between justice and failure, between community triumph and corporate retaliation that would destroy everything they'd built in Moonrise Harbor. Harbor positions, report status, he called over marine radio. Captain Valdez responded immediately, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd coordinated emergency operations in impossible conditions. Main perimeter is holding. 6 vehicles maintaining position at the access road, but no advance toward the harbor. They're waiting for something. Waiting for what? Tommy Chen's voice cut through the radio traffic with news that made Jake's blood run cold. They're not trying to storm our position. They're isolating us. I'm detecting additional jamming equipment being deployed around the entire harbor. They're cutting off all electronic communications except what they control. The tactical implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Blackstone wasn't planning a direct assault that would create dramatic footage for Avery's livestream. They were implementing a sophisticated isolation protocol that would cut Moonrise Harbor off from the outside world while maintaining plausible deniability about their actions. Electronic siege warfare, Sophia said grimly, recognizing the strategy from her years of evading corporate security forces. They'll jam our communications, disrupt our internet access, and wait for us to exhaust our resources. Then they'll claim they were responding to reports of terrorist activity and had to establish a security perimeter. How long can we maintain the upload under these conditions? Iris Fletcher studied diagnostic data that painted an increasingly dire picture. Current transmission rate gives us maybe 6 hours for critical evidence, 12 hours for everything. But that assumes they don't escalate the electronic interference. And if they do escalate, then we're looking at equipment failure that could corrupt the remaining evidence and make it inadmissible in federal court. Jake stared at the upload progress bar, which now showed 61% complete, but climbing with agonizing slowness. 18 months of critical evidence had been transmitted, enough to trigger federal investigations, but not enough to guarantee that every guilty party would face appropriate consequences. Options, he asked, looking around at people who'd risked everything for principles that transcended personal safety. We fight, Elena Vasquez said from her position monitoring emergency communications. My husband died in an industrial accident that wasn't really an accident. I spent 15 years trying to get justice through proper channels and got nowhere. This is our chance to expose the system that protects corporate murderers. We adapt, Marcus Chen added, his technical training, engaged by the challenge of overcoming sophisticated jamming equipment. Electronic warfare works both ways. If they can disrupt our signals, we can disrupt theirs. Mrs. Patterson spoke from her position coordinating supply and medical support, her voice carrying the moral authority of someone who'd raised 4 children in a community where everyone looked out for each other. We hold the line. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are terrible. Jake felt something shift in the room's atmosphere as abstract commitment crystallized into practical determination. These weren't people who sought confrontation or glorified conflict. They were families who'd learned through hard experience that sometimes the only thing standing between working people and institutional exploitation was collective action based on shared principles. Marcus, what kind of countermeasures are we talking about? Directional transmitters that could overload their jamming equipment. It's risky, could damage our own systems, but it might give us a window to complete the transmission. Tommy, how much electronic warfare equipment do you actually have on that boat? Tommy Chen's response came with the slight embarrassment of someone whose technical hobbies had exceeded normal recreational boundaries. Let's just say that community college engineering courses cover a lot of practical applications that aren't in the standard curriculum. Sophia looked up from her laptop with news that changed everything. I just received confirmation from FBI agent Martinez in Portland. She's been monitoring our transmissions and has forwarded copies to the Justice Department's Public Integrity section. Even if they stop us now, federal prosecution is inevitable. But, but completing the upload would provide evidence for additional charges that could destroy Blackstone's entire corporate structure. Environmental crimes, systematic bribery, financial fraud, everything needed to ensure that this never happens again. Jake felt the weight of decisions settling over him like responsibility for a crew heading into storm waters. They'd already achieved their primary mission, justice for Ryan and the other murdered workers, was now guaranteed. The question was whether they could survive the next few hours and complete the evidence transmission that would prevent future families from enduring similar losses. Avery, how's the live stream holding up? 2,400 viewers and growing. The interference is affecting video quality, but audio is clear and the chat is exploding. People are sharing this across every social media platform. Hashtag Moonrise Justice is trending on Twitter. What are they saying? Mostly support. Small town fights corporate corruption. David versus Goliath in real time. Some people are calling their representatives demanding federal investigation into Blackstone's activities. Jake looked around the community center at people who'd transformed a routine evidence upload into something approaching a national movement for corporate accountability. In 6 hours, they'd gone from a handful of individuals seeking personal justice to a community that was inspiring similar resistance across the country. Upload status, he asked Sophia. 63% complete. If we can maintain current transmission rates, critical evidence will finish uploading in 47 minutes. Everything else will take approximately 4 hours. Outside, the sound of additional vehicles suggested that Blackstone was escalating their response to match the growing public attention. But inside the community center, surrounded by people who'd proven that ordinary citizens could fight institutional power when they decided to stand together, Jake felt something approaching confidence that they would survive whatever corporate retaliation was coming. 47 minutes, he announced to the room. We hold them for 47 minutes, and we win completely. The battle for Ryan Brennan's justice had reached its critical phase, and everything would be decided by whether community determination could outlast corporate resources in a contest that would define the future of institutional accountability in America. At 1:47 a.m., the electronic warfare escalated from sophisticated interference to direct assault on Moonrise Harbor's communications infrastructure. Jake watched in horrified fascination as Iris Fletcher's computer terminals began displaying error messages that suggested their internet connection was being systematically dismantled by people who understood exactly how fiber optic networks function. They're not just jamming us anymore, Iris announced, her voice tight with professional anger at seeing communication systems she'd spent decades learning to protect being corrupted by corporate power. They're attacking the physical network infrastructure, cutting fiber lines, overloading, switching stations, turning our own internet service provider against us. Sophia looked up from her laptop where the upload progress had ground to a near halt, despite her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain connectivity through alternate pathways. Transmission rate is down to 8% of optimal speed. At this rate, we're looking at 16 hours to complete the upload. 16 hours we don't have, Jake said, understanding that Blackstone's patience with electronic siege warfare was probably measured in minutes rather than hours. Corporate executives who'd ordered the murder of 23 workers wouldn't hesitate to escalate to direct violence if their technical solutions proved inadequate. Harbor Control, this is Pacific Dream. Tommy Chen's voice crackled across marine radio with news that confirmed Jake's worst fears. Multiple additional vehicles approaching from Highway 101, looks like 3 unmarked vans and what appears to be a mobile command center. Professional equipment, coordinated movement patterns. Captain Valdez responded immediately, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who'd coordinated emergency responses in conditions where mistakes proved fatal. Copy that, Tommy. Total vehicle count now exceeds 12 personnel estimate, approaching 40 individuals. This isn't corporate security anymore. This is a military-style operation. Jake grabbed binoculars and moved to the community center's windows, where he could see vehicle lights establishing positions that surrounded Moonrise Harbor with the systematic thoroughness of people who'd planned similar operations before. The corporate response had evolved from legal pressure to electronic warfare to what appeared to be preparation for physical assault on American citizens exercising constitutional rights. Avery, what's the live stream situation? 3,200 viewers and growing exponentially. Hashtag Moonrise. Justice is trending nationally now. I'm seeing shares from journalists, environmental activists, labor organizers, federal legislators. Congressional representatives are tweeting questions about Blackstone's activities. Jake felt a moment of hope that public attention might protect them from the worst corporate retaliation, but Sophia's expression suggested that media coverage could actually escalate the danger they faced. Public attention is double-edged, she said, monitoring corporate communication channels that most civilians couldn't access. Blackstone can't let this story develop into a national movement for corporate accountability. They'll take increasingly desperate measures to contain the situation. Meaning what exactly? Meaning they'll claim we're terrorists or criminals threatening national security. Federal agencies that aren't on their payroll will be told this is a matter of industrial espionage or environmental terrorism. By morning, corporate media will be reporting that unstable individuals attacked a legitimate business with fabricated evidence. The tactical situation was deteriorating faster than Jake had anticipated. What had begun as a straightforward evidence upload was becoming a test of whether American citizens could still expose corporate crimes without facing retaliation that resembled military occupation. Marcus, what's the status on those electronic countermeasures? Marcus Chen's voice carried the focused intensity of someone whose technical training was being tested under combat conditions. Directional transmitters are ready, but deploying them will definitely damage some of our own equipment. It's a one-shot solution that might give us 30 minutes of clear transmission time. And then we'll be operating on backup systems that can't handle the data volume we need to complete the upload. Jake weighed options that all seemed to lead toward greater danger and uncertain outcomes. They could trigger the electronic countermeasures and hope 30 minutes would be enough to transmit the remaining critical evidence. They could maintain current operations and hope federal intervention arrived before Blackstone escalated to direct violence. Or they could surrender and watch 5 years of evidence gathering disappear into corporate legal proceedings designed to protect institutional murder. Before he could make the decision, his phone rang with a call that changed everything. Jake Brennan. Mr. Brennan, this is FBI agent Sarah Martinez calling from Portland. I've been monitoring your situation through official channels, and I need you to understand something immediately. Jake put the call on speaker so everyone in the community center could hear federal law enforcement's assessment of their rapidly deteriorating circumstances. Agent Martinez, we're transmitting evidence of systematic corporate murder to federal agencies. Are you here to help or to protect Blackstone's interests? I'm here to inform you that the Justice Department has opened formal criminal investigations into Blackstone Marine Corps based on evidence you've already transmitted. Multiple federal agencies are now involved, and arrest warrants are being prepared for senior executives. The community center erupted in quiet celebration as people absorbed the news that their primary mission had already succeeded. Federal prosecution of Ryan's killers was now inevitable, regardless of what happened in the next few hours. But Agent Martinez continued, her voice carrying notes of warning that dampened the celebration. I need you to understand that the individuals surrounding your location aren't legitimate corporate security personnel. We've identified several known federal contractors with connections to military intelligence operations. This situation has escalated beyond normal corporate damage control. What are you saying? I'm saying that Blackstone has hired people who specialize in making problems disappear permanently. The electronic warfare and physical isolation you're experiencing are preludes to an operation designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. Sophia leaned toward the phone, her voice carrying 5 years of experience, evading exactly the kind of people Agent Martinez was describing. How much time do we have? Unknown. But I need you to understand that maintaining your current position may not be survivable. These aren't corporate lawyers or private investigators. These are people who've conducted similar operations in countries where witness protection doesn't exist. Jake felt ice crystallize in his veins as he understood that their confrontation with corporate power had attracted federal contractors who specialized in permanent solutions to institutional problems. The evidence upload that was supposed to bring justice for murdered workers had triggered a response that could make Moonrise Harbor a casualty of corporate warfare. Agent Martinez, what do you recommend? Evacuate immediately. Federal marshals are en route, but they won't arrive for at least 2 hours. The evidence you've already transmitted is sufficient for prosecution, Don't sacrifice your lives trying to complete the upload. Jake looked around the community center at people who'd risked everything for principles that transcended personal safety. Captain Valdez, who'd spent 30 years rescuing fishing crews from impossible situations. Elena Vasquez, who'd fought corporate lawyers for 15 years, seeking justice for her husband's death. Avery, whose live stream was inspiring similar resistance movements across the country. Negative Agent Martinez, we're not running. Mr. Brennan, you need to understand. I understand that corporate power has been murdering working people with impunity for decades because nobody was willing to fight back. I understand that my brother died trying to protect his fellow workers and 18 other families never learned the truth about their murdered loved ones. Jake's voice carried across the community center with the authority of someone who'd found clarity in the face of impossible odds. We're going to complete this upload and ensure that every piece of evidence reaches federal investigators. If that makes us targets for corporate assassination, then at least we'll die fighting for something that matters. Jake! Sophia started to object, but he cut her off with a gesture. Marcus, deploy the countermeasures. Give us 30 minutes of clear transmission time. Dad, Avery said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. The live stream audience is over 4,000 now. If they kill us, it'll be documented in real time for thousands of witnesses. Then they'll have to live with the consequences. Jake replied, understanding that they'd moved beyond the point where personal safety mattered more than institutional justice. Outside, the sound of approaching footsteps suggested that Blackstone's patience with siege warfare was reaching its limit. But inside the community center, surrounded by people who'd proven that ordinary citizens could fight institutional power when they decided to stand together, Jake felt something approaching peace with the choice they'd made. Electronic countermeasures in 30 seconds. Marcus announced, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone about to trigger systems that couldn't be undone. Agent Martinez's voice came through the phone one final time, carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. Mr. Brennan, for what it's worth, Ryan would be proud of what you're doing. Federal prosecution will honor his sacrifice. Upload status, Jake asked Sophia. 67% complete. If the countermeasures work, we can finish transmitting critical evidence in 28 minutes. 28 minutes to complete Ryan Brennan's quest for justice. 28 minutes to prove that corporate power couldn't murder working people without consequences. 28 minutes to demonstrate that ordinary Americans could still make a difference when they decided to fight for principles that mattered. Deploy countermeasures, Jake ordered. The battle for institutional accountability was about to reach its climax, and everything would be decided by whether community courage could outlast corporate violence in a confrontation that would define the future of justice in America. The electronic countermeasures triggered at exactly 2:15 a.m. with a sound like controlled thunder rolling across Moonrise Harbor. Marcus Chen's directional transmitters overloaded Blackstone's jamming equipment in a cascade of electromagnetic energy that temporarily restored full communications and internet connectivity, but also announced to every corporate operator within 50 miles that the siege had entered its final phase. Transmission speed back to optimal. Sophia announced, her fingers flying across her keyboard as the upload progress bar surged forward. 26 minutes for complete evidence package if we can maintain this connection. But even as she spoke, the tactical situation around the harbor exploded into coordinated chaos that had suggested Blackstone's corporate soldiers had been waiting for exactly this moment to begin their final assault. Contact! 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 Tommy Chen's voice erupted across marine radio with the controlled urgency of someone reporting immediate combat. Multiple boats approaching from offshore fast movers with military signatures. They're not showing navigation lights, and they're running silent until now. Captain Valdez responded immediately from his position aboard the Maria Elena, his voice carrying 30 years of experience, coordinating emergency operations in impossible conditions. All fishing vessels assume defensive formation Alpha. These waters are under local maritime jurisdiction. We have every right to defend against unlawful intrusion. Jake grabbed binoculars and moved to the community center's observation deck, where he could see the harbor transforming from peaceful anchorage into something resembling a naval battlefield. Corporate assault boats materialized from the darkness like predators emerging from deep water, their black hulls cutting through the harbor chop with military precision. How many boats? He called over radio. 4 confirmed, possibly more, using the offshore fog bank for concealment. Marcus Chen replied, his voice tight with concentration as he operated surveillance equipment that would have impressed Coast Guard intelligence officers. Professional-grade rigid inflatables, each carrying 6 to 8 personnel with tactical equipment. The corporate boats spread into attack formation with the coordinated efficiency of special operations forces, but they immediately encountered something their planners hadn't anticipated: fishing crews who'd spent decades learning to operate as a coordinated fleet in conditions where individual mistakes prove fatal for everyone. Captain Valdez's salmon trawler Maria Elena positioned herself between the assault boats in the community center, her deck lights blazing like a beacon that announced the beginning of resistance. Corporate vessels, this is Captain Miguel Valdez, representing Moonrise Harbor Fishing Cooperative. You are entering local waters without proper authorization. State your business or withdraw immediately. The response came not in words but in action as the lead assault boat accelerated toward the Maria Elena with obvious intent to ram or board. But Valdez had anticipated exactly this response, and his counter-move demonstrated why fishing captains commanded respect throughout the Pacific maritime community. All vessels execute Tactic 7, Valdez called over radio, his voice calm despite the approaching collision. The harbor erupted into coordinated activity as fishing boats that had seemed randomly positioned suddenly revealed themselves as elements of a defensive formation that channeled the assault boats into predetermined killing zones. Tommy Chen's Pacific Dream emerged from behind the fuel dock with her deck lights blazing, while Elena Vasquez's husband's old boat Esperanza moved to block the southern harbor entrance. The corporate assault boats found themselves caught in a maze of fishing vessels that used superior local knowledge to neutralize their speed and coordination advantages. Every approach to the community center was blocked by boats whose captains had spent decades learning to coordinate in conditions where communication delays could mean the difference between successful rescue and maritime disaster. They're trying to force passage through the main channel, Tommy Chen reported, his voice tight with concentration as he maneuvered to intercept. But they don't understand harbor currents during tide change. The lead assault boat discovered this tactical disadvantage when it attempted to navigate between the Maria Elena and the fuel dock at high speed. Local currents that fishing captains knew by instinct, it caught the unfamiliar hull and slammed it sideways into pilings that had been engineered to withstand Pacific storms. Corporate Boat 1 is disabled, Marcus Chen announced with grim satisfaction. Engine damage, possible hull breach. They're taking on water. But the corporate forces adapted, quickly splitting their remaining boats to attack from multiple directions, while the fishing fleet was committed to defending the main approach. 2 assault boats circled toward the harbor's western entrance, where Mrs. Patterson's grandson operated a small craft that couldn't possibly stop professional military operators. Western approach, we have a problem, the teenager's voice crackled over radio with controlled fear. 2 boats coming fast, and I can't maneuver quick enough to intercept. Jake felt his heart sink as he realized that their defensive formation had a fatal gap that corporate tacticians were exploiting with professional efficiency. The fishing fleet had superior local knowledge and coordination, but they were essentially armed with navigation lights and marine radios against opponents who carried equipment designed for coastal warfare. That's when Rosa Martinez demonstrated why harbor communities survived by taking care of each other in ways that outsiders never understood. All vessels, this is fuel dock control. Her voice cut across radio traffic with the authority of someone who'd coordinated emergency operations for 20 years. Execute emergency lighting protocol 9 immediately. Every boat in Moonrise Harbor simultaneously activated emergency flares, searchlights, and warning systems in a coordinated display that turned the dark harbor into blazing daylight. The sudden illumination overloaded the night vision equipment that corporate operators depended on, leaving them temporarily blinded, while fishing crews who knew the harbor by touch continued maneuvering with practiced efficiency. Corporate boats 2 and 3 are disoriented, Marcus Chen reported. They have lost formation and are heading toward the sandbar on the eastern approach. The harbor's defensive advantages became apparent as corporate assault boats designed for open ocean operations encountered the shallow water hidden obstacles and tidal currents that local fishermen navigated by instinct. One boat grounded on a sandbar that had claimed overconfident sailors for generations, while another found itself trapped in the narrow channel between the marina and the rock jetty that protected the harbor from Pacific storms. But Blackstone's forces weren't finished. The remaining assault boat, crewed by operators who'd apparently studied the harbor's layout in advance, made a direct run at the community center's waterfront access point with the obvious intention of landing assault troops who could storm the building and destroy the evidence upload. Last corporate boat is making final approach. Captain Valdez announced, his voice carrying the grim recognition that their improvised naval defense was about to face its ultimate test. All available vessels converge on the community center pier. Jake watched through binoculars as the final assault boat accelerated towards shore with desperate determination, and his crew apparently willing to sacrifice their vessel in exchange for stopping the evidence transmission that would destroy Blackstone Marine Corps forever. The boat was 50 yards from shore when Elena Vasquez proved that 15 years of fighting corporate lawyers had taught her more than legal strategy. "Corporate boat, this is fishing vessel Esperanza," her voice carried across the harbor with the controlled fury of someone who'd lost everything to institutional indifference. "My husband died in an industrial accident that wasn't really an accident. You killed him to protect corporate profits, and you're not killing anyone else tonight." The Esperanza emerged from behind the breakwater like an avenging spirit, her diesel engine roaring with power that had hauled fishing nets through impossible weather for 20 years. Elena had positioned her boat to intercept the assault craft at the exact moment when its crew would be focused on their landing approach rather than defensive maneuvering. The collision was spectacular and decisive. The Esperanza struck the assault boat amidships with the full weight of steel hull and diesel engine, sending corporate operators flying into harbor water that was cold enough to incapacitate even professional swimmers within minutes. "Corporate assault boat 4 is disabled and sinking," Marcus Chen announced. "Personnel in the water, but they're wearing tactical gear that's dragging them down in the current." The harbor battle was over as suddenly as it had begun, leaving Blackstone's naval assault force disabled, grounded, or swimming for shore and water that local fishermen knew was treacherous even for experienced maritime operators. Corporate planners who'd expected to overwhelm a small coastal community had discovered that local knowledge and community coordination could neutralize superior equipment and training. "Harbor Control, this is Maria Elena," Captain Valdez announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd defended his community against overwhelming odds. "All corporate vessels are disabled or retreating. Harbor approaches are secure." Jake felt something approaching amazement as he surveyed the tactical aftermath of a naval engagement that had been won by fishing crews using nothing more sophisticated than local knowledge, community coordination, and the kind of stubborn courage that sustained maritime communities through generations of storms and economic hardship. "Casualties?" he asked over radio. "Minor hull damage to Esperanza, some equipment damage across the fleet, but no injuries to our people," Valdez replied. "Corporate personnel are being pulled from the water by Coast Guard units that appeared about 5 minutes ago." Coast Guard. Agent Martinez apparently coordinated federal maritime response while we were dealing with the assault boats. "Professional courtesy, they let us handle the initial defense, then moved in to arrest survivors and secure evidence." Through the community center windows, Jake could see Coast Guard cutters surrounding the disabled corporate vessels with the systematic efficiency of law enforcement officers who'd been monitoring the situation and waiting for the appropriate moment to intervene. Flashing lights and federal authority transformed what had been a corporate assault into a criminal investigation that would add maritime warfare to the charges facing Blackstone's executives. "Upload status?" he asked Sophia, understanding that the harbor battle had been fought to buy time for evidence transmission that would make physical destruction of their operation irrelevant. 84% complete," she announced, her voice carrying the exhausted satisfaction of someone who'd maintained technical operations while naval combat raged around her. 14 minutes for everything but the critical evidence, finished uploading 6 minutes ago." Jake looked around the community center at people who'd risked everything to prove that ordinary Americans could still fight institutional power when they decided to stand together. Captain Valdez coordinating defensive operations with the calm efficiency of someone who'd spent 30 years rescuing people from impossible situations. Elena Vasquez using her boat as a weapon against the same corporate forces that had killed her husband. Marcus Chen operating surveillance equipment that had given them tactical advantages over professional military operators. These weren't people who sought confrontation or glorified violence. They were families who'd learned through hard experience that sometimes the only thing standing between working people and institutional exploitation was collective action based on shared principles and community solidarity. Harbor Control, this is FBI Agent Martinez aboard Coast Guard cutter Steadfast. A new voice cut across radio traffic with the authority of federal law enforcement. We have 23 corporate personnel in custody, multiple vessels seized as evidence, and arrest warrants being executed for Blackstone executives across the Pacific Northwest. The battle for Ryan Brennan's justice had been won not by superior firepower or professional military training, but by ordinary people who'd refused to let corporate power operate with impunity in their community. And the evidence they'd fought to transmit would ensure that no other families would suffer the losses that had brought them together in common cause. At 2:41 a.m., with the harbor battle concluded and Coast Guard vessels securing the perimeter around disabled corporate assault boats, the real victory played out in streams of data flowing from Moonrise Harbor to servers across the United States. Sophia's laptop displayed a transmission status that represented 5 years of evidence gathering finally reaching its intended destination, the people with power and integrity to ensure justice for murdered workers. 92% upload complete. Sophia announced, her voice carrying exhausted triumph as she monitored data flows to 47 different recipients. FBI, Justice Department, Environmental Protection Agency, Congressional Oversight Committees, major news organizations, everyone who needs this evidence is receiving it simultaneously. Jake watched the progress bar crawl toward completion, understanding that each percentage point represented another piece of Ryan's investigation, reaching federal prosecutors who could finally hold Blackstone accountable for systematic murder. The harbor battle had been spectacular, but this quiet transmission of digital evidence would determine whether their sacrifice had lasting meaning. What exactly are we sending them? Avery asked, adjusting her live stream equipment to document the final phase of an operation that had captivated over 5,000 viewers across social media platforms. Iris Fletcher pulled up the distribution manifest on her terminal, displaying a catalog of evidence that read like a prosecutor's fantasy. Corporate emails ordering worker deaths, financial records showing bribes to government officials, audio recordings of supervisors planning industrial accidents, security footage proving the official investigations were fraudulent, environmental data documenting systematic contamination that was covered up for decades, plus Ryan's complete investigation. Sophia added, highlighting a subfolder that contained everything Jake's brother had gathered before his murder. Video documentation of safety violations, recorded conversations with supervisors who pressured workers to bypass protective protocols, a journal where he predicted his own death and identified the corporate officials responsible. The scope of evidence was overwhelming. Jake counted financial crimes, environmental violations, and systematic murder documentation that could destroy Blackstone's entire corporate structure and send dozens of executives to federal prison for the rest of their lives. 96% complete, Sophia announced. 4 minutes until every piece of evidence is permanently archived and distributed beyond corporate reach. Agent Martinez's voice crackled through the marine radio with news that confirmed the broader implications of their success. Mr. Brennan, I need you to understand what you've accomplished tonight. Based on the evidence you've transmitted, the Justice Department is preparing the largest corporate criminal prosecution in American history. How large? Jake asked. 47 federal arrest warrants across 6 states. RICO charges for systematic criminal conspiracy. Environmental terrorism charges for deliberately contaminating protected waterways. Multiple counts of first-degree murder for the 23 confirmed worker deaths. Jake felt something approaching disbelief at the magnitude of justice that Ryan's investigation had finally triggered. His brother's death had seemed meaningless. For 5 years, just another industrial accident that corporate power had buried under legal proceedings and media silence. Now that same death was catalyzing federal prosecution that would destroy an entire criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate business. What about the government officials who took bribes? Avery asked, her journalist instincts focused on institutional corruption that enabled corporate crimes. Separate federal investigations are being opened into regulatory capture and political corruption. Senators, EPA administrators, federal judges, everyone who took Blackstone money is facing federal prosecution for violating public trust. The political implications were staggering. Jake tried to imagine the congressional hearings, the media coverage, the public outrage that would follow, revelations that multiple federal agencies had been systematically corrupted by corporate influence. 98% complete. Sophia announced, her voice tight with emotion, as 5 years of evidence gathering approached its conclusion. 2 minutes until everything is permanently archived and beyond corporate reach. Through the community center windows, Jake could see Coast Guard personnel arresting corporate operators who'd been pulled from harbor waters after their assault boats were disabled by fishing crews defending their community. Federal marshals were securing evidence that would support additional charges of maritime assault and domestic terrorism. The corporate response is being documented in real time, Avery said, highlighting social media feeds where her live stream had been shared thousands of times. Corporate executives ordering military-style assault on American citizens. Private contractors attacking a fishing community that was transmitting evidence of criminal conspiracy. This is visual proof of how corporate power operates when legal restraints become inconvenient. Jake understood that Avery's documentation had captured something beyond mere evidence of specific crimes. Her broadcast had shown the American public how institutional power responded when ordinary citizens refused to accept injustice as inevitable. The images of fishing boats defending their community against corporate assault forces would resonate far beyond Moonrise Harbor. 99% complete, Sophia announced. 60 seconds until the upload is finished and Ryan's justice is guaranteed. The final minute felt like an eternity as Jake watched data streams carrying his brother's investigation to federal prosecutors who would ensure that corporate murder finally faced appropriate consequences. Everything they'd risked, their lives, their community, their future, had been wagered on the belief that evidence and courage could still triumph over institutional corruption. 100% complete, Sophia announced at exactly 2:47 a.m., her voice breaking with emotion as the upload progress bar finally reached its conclusion. All evidence transmitted and permanently archived. Ryan's investigation is now in the hands of federal law enforcement. The community center erupted in quiet celebration as people absorbed the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. 5 years of evidence gathering had culminated in 6 hours of coordinated resistance that would trigger the largest corporate criminal prosecution in American history. Agent Martinez, this is Jake Brennan, he called over marine radio. Evidence transmission is complete. Every piece of documentation has been distributed to appropriate federal agencies. Copy that, Mr. Brennan. Federal marshals are executing arrest warrants for Blackstone executives as we speak. Victor Kane, James Harrison, and 12 other senior officials are already in federal custody. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as he realized that Ryan's killers were finally facing justice. After 5 years of unanswered questions, systematic cover-up, and institutional indifference, the people who'd ordered his brother's murder were being arrested by federal agents acting on evidence that Ryan himself had gathered. Upload complete, Sophia said quietly, closing her laptop with hands that shook from exhaustion and emotional release. Ryan's investigation has finally reached the people who can act on it. As dawn approached over Moonrise Harbor, Jake understood that they'd done more than expose corporate crimes or obtain justice for murdered workers. They'd proven that ordinary Americans could still make a difference when they decided to fight for principles that transcended personal safety. The evidence was transmitted. The arrests had begun. And Ryan Brennan's faith that truth would eventually prevail had finally been vindicated by a community that refused to let corporate power operate with impunity. At 3:15 p.m., as the evidence upload reached completion and corporate assault forces found themselves in federal custody, the full scope of institutional response became apparent as additional Coast Guard cutters arrived with federal marshals, FBI agents, and Justice Department prosecutors who'd been coordinating the operation from Portland. Agent Sarah Martinez stepped onto the community center dock with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Behind her came a team of federal investigators whose presence transformed what had been a community defense operation into the opening phase of the largest corporate criminal prosecution in American history. Mr. Brennan, Agent Martinez said, extending her hand with genuine respect, I want you to understand what you've accomplished tonight. The evidence Dr. Cross transmitted has triggered federal investigations that will extend far beyond Blackstone Marine Corps. Jake looked around the harbor where Coast Guard personnel were documenting corporate assault boats as evidence of domestic terrorism, while federal marshals processed prisoners who'd been pulled from the water by the same fishing crews they tried to attack. How extensive are we talking about? Systematic examination of corporate influence throughout federal regulatory agencies, congressional hearings into political corruption that enabled industrial murder, environmental investigations into contamination that was covered up for decades. Agent Martinez gestured toward the federal command vessel that had anchored just outside the harbor. This operation represents the Justice Department's commitment to institutional accountability at the highest levels. Sophia emerged from the community center with her laptop secured in its waterproof case, looking like someone who'd finally completed a mission that had defined 5 years of her life. Agent Martinez, what's the status on arrest warrants? 47 federal arrests across 6 states, with more expected as the investigation expands. Victor Kane is in federal custody in Seattle. James Harrison was arrested at his Portland residence. Corporate executives, plant supervisors, regulatory officials, even federal judges who took Blackstone money, everyone involved in this conspiracy is facing federal prosecution. The scope of justice was overwhelming. Jake tried to imagine the media coverage, the congressional hearings, the public outrage that would follow, revelations of systematic corporate murder and government corruption on this scale. What about the families of the other victims? Elena Vasquez asked, approaching the group with harbor water still dripping from her jacket after ramming the final assault boat. Will they finally learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones? Federal victim assistance coordinators are being deployed to contact every family affected by Blackstone's criminal operations. They'll receive complete files on their loved ones' cases, plus access to federal compensation programs for families of murder victims. Jake felt something shift in his chest as he realized that 22 other families would finally receive the answers he'd been seeking for 5 years. Parents, spouses, children who'd been told their loved ones died through their own carelessness would learn that they'd been murdered by corporate executives who valued profit margins more than human life. Captain Valdez approached from his position coordinating harbor security, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who'd defended his community against overwhelming odds. Ginny Martinez, what's the federal assessment of our defensive actions? Are we facing charges for interfering with the corporate operations? Agent Martinez smiled with genuine admiration for the tactical efficiency that fishing crews had demonstrated against professional military operators. Captain, you're facing commendations for citizen defense against domestic terrorism. The corporate assault on Moonrise Harbor violated multiple federal laws, and your response was entirely within legal bounds for defending American citizens against unlawful attack. The harbor battle is being documented as evidence of corporate desperation, Avery added, highlighting social media coverage where her live stream had been viewed over 50,000 times. Visual proof that institutional power resorts to violence when legal restraints become inconvenient. Agent Martinez nodded approvingly at Avery's documentation efforts. Your broadcast provided real-time evidence that will support additional federal charges against Blackstone executives. Ordering military assault on American civilians crosses every legal boundary that protects corporate operations from federal prosecution. As federal investigators began documenting the scene and processing evidence that would support what promised to be the most complex corporate criminal trial in American history, Jake found himself thinking about Ryan's final journal entry. If something happens to me, make sure Jake knows this wasn't an accident. His brother's faith that truth would eventually prevail had been vindicated by a community that refused to let corporate power operate with impunity. The evidence Ryan had died trying to expose was now in the hands of federal prosecutors who would ensure that his sacrifice had lasting meaning. Agent Martinez, Jake said, understanding that their victory carried responsibilities that extended far beyond personal justice. What happens now? Now we build federal cases that will establish legal precedent for holding corporations accountable for systematic criminal behavior, congressional hearings that will reform regulatory oversight, environmental prosecutions that will protect communities from industrial contamination. She gestured toward the harbor where Coast Guard vessels were securing evidence while federal agents processed the largest domestic terrorism arrest in Oregon history. What happened here tonight will change how corporate power operates in America. Institutional accountability isn't just possible, it's inevitable when ordinary citizens decide to fight for justice. As dawn broke over Moonrise Harbor, painting the water in shades of gold, and Hope Jake understood that they'd accomplished something beyond personal vindication or corporate prosecution. They'd proven that American democracy still functioned when citizens refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Ryan Brennan's justice had finally arrived, carried by community courage and delivered by federal agents who understood that some principles were worth defending against any threat. The first light of dawn revealed Moonrise Harbor transformed from peaceful fishing community into the epicenter of what CNN was already calling the largest corporate accountability case in American history. Federal evidence teams worked methodically through the community center, cataloging equipment and documenting the technical operation that had transmitted 5 years of criminal evidence to 47 different agencies in a single night. Jake stood on the harbor pier with Sophia watching Coast Guard personnel secure corporate assault boats that would serve as evidence of domestic terrorism charges against Blackstone executives. The morning air carried the salt scent of low tide mixed with diesel fumes from federal vessels, but also something new, the sense that institutional justice was finally within reach. Initial media response is exceeding all projections, Avery announced, approaching, with her live stream equipment still recording for an audience that had grown to over 70,000 viewers. Major networks are picking up the story. Hashtag Moonrise Justice is trending globally. Congressional representatives are calling for immediate hearings into corporate influence in federal agencies. Agent Martinez joined them with news that confirmed the broader implications of their night's work. Justice Department prosecutors are reviewing evidence packages as we speak. Initial assessments suggest we have sufficient documentation for RICO charges against Blackstone's entire executive structure, plus environmental terrorism charges that could result in life sentences. What about the government officials who took bribes? Jake asked. Separate federal investigations are being opened into regulatory capture and political corruption. EPA administrators, federal judges, congressional oversight committee members, everyone who accepted Blackstone money is facing ethics violations and potential criminal charges. Sophia secured her laptop in its waterproof case, looking like someone who'd finally completed a mission that had defined 5 years of her life. The evidence we transmitted includes financial records showing systematic bribery across multiple federal agencies. This investigation will extend far beyond corporate prosecution into governmental reform. Captain Valdez approached from his salmon trawler, where federal agents were documenting the improvised defensive modifications that had enabled fishing crews to defeat professional military operators. Mr. Brennan, the Harbor Cooperative, wants you to know we're proud of what we accomplished here. Ryan's justice was worth fighting for. Around the harbor, other fishing families were securing their boats and assessing damage from the night's naval engagement. The Esperanza showed hull damage from ramming the final assault boat, but Elena Vasquez wore the satisfaction of someone who'd finally struck back against the corporate forces that had killed her husband. Media requests are overwhelming, Iris Fletcher announced, emerging from the community center with communication equipment that had maintained their connection to the outside world throughout the siege. 60 Minutes, Dateline, Netflix documentary teams, everyone wants to tell this story. Jake looked around at his community, understanding that their quiet fishing village would never return to anonymity after becoming the site where ordinary Americans had defeated corporate terrorism through collective action. But instead of feeling loss for their former privacy, he felt pride that Moonrise Harbor had proven something important about democratic principles and community solidarity. What's next? He asked Agent Martinez. Federal grand jury proceedings begin next week. Congressional hearings into corporate influence in regulatory agencies. Environmental assessments of contamination sites that Blackstone covered up for decades. She gestured toward the harbor, where evidence teams were documenting the scene that would support the largest corporate criminal prosecution in American history. This investigation will reshape how institutional power operates in America. As federal agents continued their methodical work and media helicopters circled overhead, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Ryan's death: absolute certainty that justice would prevail. The evidence was secured, the arrests had begun, and the legal process that would honor his brother's sacrifice was now irreversible. The Portland federal courthouse steps were packed with families, journalists, and activists as Jake emerged with Sophia and Avery into afternoon sunshine that seemed to celebrate the conclusion of the most complex corporate criminal trial in American history. Behind them, 23 families who'd lost loved ones to Blackstone's systematic murder finally had the justice they'd been seeking for over a decade. Guilty on all counts, Jake announced to the assembled media, his voice carrying across Pioneer Courthouse Square where hundreds of supporters had gathered to witness the conclusion of United States versus Blackstone Marine Corps. Victor Kane James Harrison and 37 other defendants convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and systematic corruption of federal agencies. The verdicts had been overwhelming. Kane received life imprisonment without parole for ordering the deaths of 23 workers. Harrison got 45 years for systematic environmental cover-ups that had poisoned entire communities. Plant supervisors, regulatory officials, and federal judges who'd participated in the conspiracy faced sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The financial penalties are equally significant. Sophia added, addressing questions from environmental journalists who'd followed the case throughout its legal journey. 4. $7 billion in criminal fines plus $12.3 billion in victim compensation and environmental remediation. Blackstone Marine Corps has been dissolved, its assets liquidated to fund cleanup operations and family support. Avery stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone whose investigative podcast had evolved into a Netflix documentary series that was reshaping public understanding of corporate accountability. What matters most is that this case has established legal precedent for holding corporations criminally liable for systematic harm to workers and communities. Other families won't have to fight alone the way we did. Elena Vasquez spoke for the families of murdered workers, her voice carrying 15 years of accumulated grief transformed into institutional change. My husband died in 2008 in what they called an industrial accident. Today, his killers are going to federal prison for the rest of their lives. That's justice, but it's also prevention. No other families will suffer what we suffered because corporations now know there are consequences for treating workers as expendable. The legal precedents established by the Blackstone prosecution had already triggered investigations into corporate behavior across multiple industries. The Ryan Brennan Memorial Safety Foundation, established with victim compensation funds, was providing legal support to families facing similar corporate retaliation while advocating for stronger workplace protection laws. Congressional reforms have been equally significant. Iris Fletcher announced highlighting legislative changes that had emerged from congressional hearings into the regulatory capture that enabled Blackstone's crimes. The Corporate Accountability Act requires federal prosecutors to pursue criminal charges, not just civil penalties, when corporations systematically harm public safety. The Worker Protection Enhancement Act provides federal legal support for employees who report safety violations. Agent Martinez, who'd been promoted to head the Justice Department's new Corporate Crimes Division, addressed the broader implications of institutional change that had followed the Moonrise Harbor operation. This case demonstrated that federal law enforcement has both the capability and the commitment to prosecute corporate criminals at the highest levels. We've opened similar investigations into industrial practices across multiple sectors. Jake looked out at families who'd traveled from across the country to witness the conclusion of a legal process that validated their loved ones' deaths as murders rather than accidents. Parents who'd been told their children died through carelessness now understood they'd been killed by corporate executives who calculated that worker deaths were cheaper than safety improvements. The foundation has documented over 300 suspicious workplace deaths that we're investigating as potential corporate murders, Sophia announced, highlighting the scope of systematic violence that the Blackstone prosecution had revealed. Federal investigators are reviewing safety violations, insurance claims, and corporate communications to identify patterns of deliberate negligence that constitute criminal behavior. Captain Valdez represented the Moonrise Harbor community, wearing the dignified satisfaction of someone whose fishing village had become a symbol of successful resistance to institutional power. What we proved that night is that ordinary people can still make a difference when they decide to fight for what's right. Corporate power isn't invincible when communities stand together. As the crowd began to disperse, carrying news of justice achieved and precedent established, Jake felt the weight of 18 months lifting from his shoulders. Ryan's death had finally found meaning in legal changes that would protect future workers and communities from corporate violence. The battle that had begun in a small harbor had reshaped American understanding of corporate accountability and democratic possibility. Moonrise Harbor in late autumn bore little resemblance to the quiet fishing village where Jake had once expected to spend his life repairing boat engines and watching his daughter grow up in peaceful anonymity. The harbor now hosted research vessels alongside traditional fishing boats, and the economy had diversified far beyond simple survival into something approaching sustainable prosperity. The Moonrise Marine Research Institute occupied the renovated buildings where Blackstone's fish processing operation had once concealed environmental crimes. Sophia served as Director of Environmental Safety, leading research programs that developed cleaner fishing technologies and monitored ocean health with the same methodical thoroughness she'd once applied to gathering evidence of corporate corruption. "We've documented measurable improvement in water quality throughout the coastal zone," she announced to the quarterly community meeting that had replaced the emergency gathering where they'd first planned their air resistance to corporate power. The cleanup operations funded by Blackstone's asset liquidation have removed decades of accumulated contamination. Jake operated from an expanded marina facility that served both traditional fishing boats and the research vessels that had made Moonrise Harbor a center for marine environmental studies. His mechanical expertise had proven invaluable for maintaining sophisticated scientific equipment, and the skills he'd learned from Ryan's hidden modifications had evolved into legitimate marine technology development. The Harbor Cooperative has approved funding for 3 additional research berths, Captain Valdez announced, representing a fishing community that had successfully adapted to economic changes without losing its essential character. Tourism revenue from environmental education programs is now supporting 12 full-time jobs that didn't exist 2 years ago. The community had attracted attention from sustainable development organizations, marine science institutions, and documentary filmmakers who wanted to understand how a small coastal town had defeated corporate terrorism and emerged stronger than before. But the most significant change was intangible, a sense of collective efficacy that came from proving that ordinary people could fight institutional power and win. Federal environmental monitoring has confirmed that our fishing grounds are now among the cleanest on the Pacific coast. Tommy Chen reported, highlighting economic benefits that accompanied environmental restoration. Premium pricing for sustainably harvested seafood has increased fishing revenue by 40% over pre-trial levels. Avery's documentary work had evolved into a multimedia platform that chronicled corporate accountability efforts across the country. Her podcast audience had grown to over 100,000 subscribers, and her Netflix series Harbor Justice had inspired similar community resistance movements in industrial towns from Louisiana to Alaska. "I'm documenting 12 communities that have used our example to fight corporate pollution and worker exploitation," she announced to the community meeting. The Moonrise Harbor model is being replicated wherever people decide that corporate power shouldn't operate without accountability. Mrs. Patterson spoke for the older generation that had watched their community transform from economic vulnerability into something approaching national significance. "We've always taken care of each other here. What's different now is that we've proven we can take care of ourselves against any threat, no matter how powerful." The Ryan Brennan Memorial, which anchored the harbor's transformed waterfront, had become a pilgrimage site for families of industrial accident victims and labor organizers who drew inspiration from evidence that justice remained possible in corporate America. Avery's artistic vision had created something that honored the dead while inspiring continued resistance to institutional violence. International environmental organizations are requesting partnership agreements for research programs. Iris Fletcher announced, highlighting global attention that their community resistance had attracted. The harbor is being studied as a model for how communities can recover from systematic corporate exploitation. Jake looked around the meeting room at faces that reflected both pride in their accomplishments and determination to continue the work that Ryan's death had initiated. They'd proven that American democracy still functioned when citizens refused to accept injustice as inevitable, and their example was inspiring similar resistance movements across the country. Moonrise Harbor had become more than a fishing village. It was a symbol of what remained possible when ordinary people decided to fight for principles that transcended personal safety. On a clear Saturday morning in November, 18 months after the night that changed everything, Jake Brennan stood at the harbor's edge, waiting for his life to officially begin again. The wedding ceremony would take place on the pier where Sophia had first arrived with her mysterious sailboat and her dangerous secrets, surrounded by the community that had risked everything to ensure that love could grow from the ashes of shared struggle. Avery appeared beside him, wearing the kind of elegant dress that suggested she was growing into the remarkable woman her mother had always known she would become. At 18, she'd already established herself as an investigative journalist whose work had helped expose corporate crimes across multiple industries. But today, she was simply a daughter preparing to watch her father marry someone who'd become family through crisis and commitment. "You ready for this, Dad?" she asked, adjusting the boutonniere she'd insisted on making from wildflowers that grew along the coastal cliffs where her mother was buried. "I've been ready since the night as she told me about Ryan," Jake replied, understanding that his love for Sophia had been forged in the crucible of seeking justice for his brother's murder. "What about you? Are you ready to officially have Dr. Cross as a stepmother?" "I've been ready since she proved she was willing to risk everything to honor Uncle Ryan's memory." Avery said, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd learned early that family was defined by choice and commitment rather than simple biology. The wedding guests reflected the community that had been transformed by their collective resistance to corporate power. Captain Valdez and his wife Elena had decorated their fishing boats with signal flags that spelled out maritime congratulations. Tommy Chen and his son Marcus had used their technical expertise to create a sound system that would carry the ceremony across the harbor. Iris Fletcher served as officiant, her years of journalism experience having qualified her for duties that extended far beyond library management. "The bride approaches," Edith Martinez announced, with the satisfied tone of someone who'd watched justice prevail against impossible odds. She'd traveled from Portland to witness the conclusion of a personal story that had begun with federal law enforcement and evolved into something approaching family. Sophia walked down the pier alone, having chosen to honor her own independence rather than traditional ceremonies that didn't reflect the unconventional way their love had developed. She wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes and carried wildflowers that Avery had helped her gather from the same coastal cliffs where they'd first talked about Ryan's murder and corporate accountability. Jake felt his breath catch as she approached, seeing past the careful composure that had sustained her through 5 years of running from corporate assassins to the woman who'd sacrificed everything for principles that mattered more than personal safety. She'd taught him that love could grow from shared purpose, that the strongest relationships were forged in struggles for justice that transcended individual comfort. "Dearly beloved Iris Fletcher," began her voice carrying across the harbor to boats that had been decorated for celebration. "We gathered today to witness the union of two people who found each other in the midst of fighting for something larger than personal happiness." The vows they had written themselves reflected the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. Jake promised to honor Sophia's commitment to corporate accountability and environmental protection. She promised to help him continue Ryan's legacy of fighting for worker safety and community solidarity. "By the power vested in me by the state of Oregon and the Moonrise Harbor community," Iris Fletcher announced, "I pronounce you husband and wife." As Jake kissed Sophia while fishing boats sounded their horns in celebration, he understood that they'd built something stronger than traditional romance. Their love had been tested by a corporate violence federal prosecution and the kind of institutional pressure that destroyed most relationships before they could develop into lasting commitment. Avery's documentary cameras captured the conclusion of a love story that had begun with evidence of systematic murder and evolved into hope that justice and personal happiness could coexist in a world dominated by institutional power. The battle for Ryan Brennan's justice was over, but the love it had created would endure for as long as two people remained committed to fighting for principles that mattered more than personal comfort.